Section 11 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8, Wellington's Offensive Campaigns, Part 1. The time was now near when it would be possible and profitable to assume the offensive and strike directly at the French in Leon and Castile. Portugal had been secured by the craft and daring which wrested the two frontier fortresses from the enemy. The next thing was to break the direct line of communication between Seville and Madrid, and that was accomplished when Hill, the best of all his lieutenants, victoriously surprised the French at Almaraz, broke the bridge, destroyed the works on the right bank, and blockaded the fort on the Mirabete on the left, which an irresolute officer failed to seize. The French having been deprived of Almaraz by Wellington's direction, the engineer Sturgeon repaired the bridge at Alcantara, and thus a shorter line of communication was established between the British forces on the Agueda and those in Estremadura. At the same time, the navigation of the Douro and Tagus was improved to facilitate the transport of supplies, and finding that both marshals expected to be attacked, Wellington did all he could to confirm each in his opinion. The consequence was that no plan of concerted operations against him could be formed, and from his own sources of intelligence and their intercepted letters, he was acquainted with the dissensions raging in the hostile camps. King Joseph, who had been made commander-in-chief, was unable to exact obedience from his captains, and thus the British general, who was bent on an offensive movement, enjoyed the advantage which it confers on one acting against perplexed and jealous adversaries. By patience and sound judgment at all times, by a wise audacity at the right moment, he had obtained a military as well as a moral ascendancy, and was about to reap the harvest which his long suffering, his ceaseless labours, and his genius as a soldier and statesman had sown and nurtured in an ungrateful soil. When Napoleon, on June 13th, at the head of the Grand Army, was advancing on the Niemen, the little Anglo-Portuguese host, so long held at bay, sprang joyfully over the Agueda and marched towards Salamanca. 4 days afterwards they were over the fords of the Tormes, and while one division invested the fortified convents, Wellington faced Marmont from the heights of San Cristobal. The French marshal advanced to relieve the forts which were now enduring a siege, and he had a fair chance, for the means, as usual, were insufficient, although on this occasion the error in judgment was caused by the imperfect report of spies. Hence the guns were too few or unsuitable, the bright moon hindered the working parties, and the engineers were still engaged in their task when Marmont hastened over the plain with 25,000 men. Then, while the forts were battered day after day, the two main armies manoeuvred and wrestled on the hills and on both sides of the Tormes. Neither would take the initiative in a battle, Marmont because he could not get a chance which suited him, Wellington because he would not risk the success of his large plans, even when his rival furnished an opportunity. At one moment the siege operations were stayed for want of ammunition, but it was not until June 27th, 10 days after the investment, that the garrison was compelled to surrender. For some reason, either weakness in cavalry or the knowledge that reinforcements from the north and centre would not arrive, Marmont, after the fall of the forts, retreated over the Douro. The mere incursion of Wellington had shaken the French defensive system, for Bonnet's fine division was drawn from the Asturias, which enabled the Galician troops to invest Astorga, and the partisans on the coast, aided by Admiral Popham's squadron, as far east as Bilbao, to resume their activity. The French held Toro, Tordesillas, and Tudela on the river, and Wellington, following, took post on the left bank, for his advance was arrested by the strength of the position, and his usual difficulties growing out of want of money were almost fatal. Bonnet there joined Marmont, and the latter thought that the time had come to retort upon his adversary. He resolved to cross the Douro, and his plans were so cleverly laid and neatly executed that he succeeded in gaining an initial advantage. For he marched 2 whole divisions to the left bank at Toro, and when attention had been drawn thither, he rapidly marched them back, and flung his whole army over the stream at Tordesillas. Wellington was not wholly surprised, but he was in peril. To meet an attack from Toro, he had collected his left and centre on the Guarena, but the right was still on the Trabancos under Sir Stapleton Cotton, and on July 18th was in the presence of the French army. He held his ground and imposed on the adversary for a few hours, but some French horse dashing over the stream and nearly capturing both Wellington and Beresford, found that only a part of the army was in line. Thereupon Marmont, who was bold enough and apt in invention, sent his masses onwards toward the Guarena, bent on turning the British right, and the two armies marched for 10 miles on an open plain in parallel lines. The French marshal hoped to reach the commanding tableland at Vallesa, but he was forestalled by his alert antagonist and lost some men and a general in a combat near Castrillon. After a day's halt, the game of manoeuvres was resumed by Marmont, who, moving swiftly up the Guarena, crossed it near its sources and fairly turned the right of the Allied position at Vallesa. And then the two armies once more marched side by side, racing to gain positions near Salamanca. The French had the better, for although Wellington secured the hills in front of San Cristobal, Marmont planted his troops on the heights above the Tormes, which commanded the ford at Huerta, which gave him an access to the country on the left bank. So far the Marshal had won the advantage in manoeuvring. In other respects the armies were fairly matched. The slight superiority in number was on the side of the Allies, who also had more cavalry, but the French were nearly as many, and they had more guns. Whether there would be a battle now depended upon Marmont, for Wellington would not fight unless his rival gave him a fair occasion. The Allies fell back to San Cristobal, and on the 21st, when Marmont, crossing the Tormes, took up a position at Calvarizza de Arriba, Wellington, leaving the 3rd Division to watch a French division established at Babi la Fuente, also planted his army on the same side of the river. He was still, while watching for a chance to fight, meditating a retreat, when the enemy on the 22nd furnished an occasion. The Allies were posted on a line at right angles to the Tormes, and the French, gathering over against them, began the fray by a contest for the commanding hills, among which were the famous Arapiles, 2 isolated craggy heights near the British right. In the first rush the French gained the outer and the British the inner hill, from which at first the leading companies were driven, but quickly recovering halfway down, and enraged at their mishap, they dashed forward and secured the summit. It was from this elevation that Wellington watched the movements of his opponent, who was opposite the British left. The French divisions coming out of the forest were seen to extend more and more to their own left, and the English line was changed until it was parallel to the Tormes. As there was no longer any need to guard the other bank, the 3rd Division was brought over and posted on the right, in the low ground about Aldea Tejada. The day advanced, yet there was no general action. Wellington went to sleep, desiring to be roused when the French left, then, pointing towards the Rodrigo road, reached a certain wood. Lord Fitzroy Somerset duly awakened his chief, who, mounting the hill, gazed steadily on the French array, and seeing how great was the gap between the moving hostile divisions and the centre, he gave the signal for battle. The whole line, pivoting upon the mountain block, descended into the lower ground, moving upon the flank of the erring enemy, while the 3rd Division threw itself forward on the front of the column, and Cotton's horsemen were straining to charge. The contest was brief, for the French division was crushed by the infantry and ridden over by the cavalry, which came like a torrent up the valley, and in less than an hour Marmont's line of battle was irretrievably broken. At the earliest perception of the danger, when he saw that Wellington, detecting his rashness, had prepared to strike, he rode forward to rectify or mitigate the blunder, but was hit severely and carried from the field. Bonnet, who succeeded, shared a like fate, and then the heavy task fell upon Clausel. At that time the whole British line had swung forward, pivoting on the left, until it was again parallel to the Tormes. So swift had been the stroke, and the great cavalry charge had spent its terrible force, so that the French, still numerous, were driven to the verge of the forest. By great energy and greater skill, Clausel, himself wounded, formed a fresh front of battle, and even made an attack, but at the right moment, when there was apparent danger, Wellington, ever watchful and resolute, brought up the 6th Division, frustrated his able foe, and continued to push him back. Clausel was now fighting to cover his retreat. He had one great advantage. The Spanish garrison posted in Alba de Tormes had been withdrawn without notice to Wellington, and thus the French got clear off in the gloom, for Wellington, thinking Alba blocked, pursued to the Huerta ford, where he found no one. His great plan was thwarted by Spanish neglect. It was in riding to the Huerta ford that he was struck by a shot, which happily passed through a holster. "I saw him late on the evening of that great day," writes Napier, "when the advancing flashes of cannon and musketry, stretching as far as the eye could command, showed in the darkness how well the field was won. He was alone, the flush of victory was on his brow, and his eyes were eager and watchful, but his voice was calm and even gentle." How different from the fierce and angry countenance and silent, abrupt bearing seen by the same acute observer on the Sierra de Busaco. It marks the difference between a retreat upon Torres Vedras before the spoilt child of victory, and an advance which was to carry him to Madrid. Clausel, with his diminished host, was forced persistently back upon Burgos. King Joseph, who had moved out of Madrid over the Guadarrama mountains, hearing of Marmont's defeat, returned hastily to his capital, which he had to quit again in disorder because the allied right wing was at his heels, and there was no succour nearer than Suchet. Wellington entered Madrid on August 12th and was welcomed as a deliverer by the people, who crowded around his horse, hung on his stirrups, touched his clothes, and throwing themselves on the earth, blessed him aloud as the friend of Spain. When he had forced the French garrison in the Retiro to surrender, Madrid for a time was free from the enemy. Yet not for many weeks. One object of the campaign was to set free Andalusia, and it was accomplished. Soult, reluctantly obeying the orders of King Joseph, raised the siege of Cadiz, destroyed guns and stores, and a fortnight after Wellington entered Madrid, had passed through Seville on the road to Valencia. An Anglo-Sicilian expedition was at Alicante. Hill watched the passes through the Sierra Morena, and Spanish troops should have followed the French to the Alcaraz mountains, but did not, which had serious results at a later period. Now it was, when the British general received sure intelligence that Soult was leaving Andalusia, that he quitted Madrid to push his warfare beyond the Douro. Nor did he move a moment too soon, for the enterprising Clausel drove the Spaniards from Valladolid in the middle of August. Foy made a bold dash down the river to pick up the garrisons left in Taro and Zamora, and the safety of the road to Salamanca was imperilled. But when on the first week of September Wellington crossed the Guadarrama and moved upon the Douro, Clausel drew in his daring troops. Valladolid was recovered, and the able Frenchman was forced back, not only to Burgos, but to Briviesca on the Oca. The obstacle now was the castle of Burgos, heavily armed, garrisoned by 1,700 French troops, and commanded by Du Breton, whose fame rivals that of Philippon. Upon the speedy reduction of this stronghold much depended, for it was a question of time, since if Soult could not be detained beyond the Tagus, or if a French army could be collected to relieve the place, the Allies would be forced to retreat upon Ciudad Rodrigo. Wellington began the siege on the 19th, hoping to finish it early, but it was strong. His guns were few and insufficient. The assaults failed, the Portuguese troops were inapt for the work, and the enemy was ingenious as well as bold. Not only were the means inadequate, but the general underrated the task, and after more than a month spent in desperate efforts to beat down the work, he was obliged to raise the siege and hurry away. For the French general Souham, sent from France, had assembled an army at Briviesca and was moving forward. The combinations designed to embarrass Soult had failed. He had joined Joseph at Almansa in the first days of October, and both were advancing on Madrid. Nothing stood in their way except the army under Hill on the Tagus, and he could not encounter the combined forces of Soult and the king. Andalusia had been relieved, but the whole available French strength was thereby enabled to converge upon the allies. With one body numerically superior close upon him, and a still more dangerous foe pointing toward his line of retreat upon Portugal, it behoved Wellington to seek safety. Nor was it easily attained, for Souham came on with resolution, and it was only by the daring step of crossing the Arlançon under the guns of the castle, a feat done by night with deftness and celerity, that the army was drawn out of reach. Yet the whole road backward to the Douro was the scene of recurring combats, for the French are great in pursuit, and all Wellington's coolness and judgment was required to extricate himself from his peril. He succeeded, and on the 29th, 8 days after he filed past Burgos, his army was over the Douro. The bridges were broken behind him, but a French captain and his company swam the river at Tordesillas and won the tower there, a feat which would have enabled Souham to cross, had not Wellington at once moved his army to the left and forbade the attempt. At this time Hill was still on the Tagus and opposite to him, the king's powerful army under Soult. The English general was so trusted by his chief that he gave him the choice of his line of retreat, but he expressed his preference for the Guadarrama route, which would enable the two fractions to unite. Hill took that line, yet not before he was pressed, and removing or destroying the stores in Madrid, he passed the mountains and took the shorter line to Alba de Tormes, because Souham, being expeditious in bridging the Douro, obliged Wellington to retire direct upon San Cristobal, instead of effecting a junction with Hill at Aravallo on the Adaja. Thus, on November 8th, after much marching and fighting, the chief and his lieutenant, at the head of 68,000 men, were united and arrayed near the battlefield of Salamanca, while the combined armies of the French, 100,000 strong, were rushing down upon them over the plains of Castile and Leon. The English general held his ground and rested his wearied troops, prepared to fight if he could, to retreat if he must. While Marshal Jourdan counselled battle, Soult preferred to manoeuvre, and his advice prevailed. But it was not until the 14th that the French host, diminished by detachments to 90,000 men, began the operation of turning the British position by ascending and crossing the Tormes in the hope of gaining the road to Ciudad Rodrigo. Then the allied host was concentrated on the old battleground, and held there in the hope of being attacked. But as Soult still worked away to his left, Wellington resolved, although they were so near, to march round the French army, a feat which he accomplished by dint of audacity, swiftness, the aid of a thick fog, and better roads. An astonishing exploit, even in war, where so much is unexpected, and only explicable on the supposition that Wellington's marches, victories, and good fortune had given him a mastery over the minds of his antagonists. Thus the roads to Ciudad Rodrigo were secured, and on the 19th the troops were back on the Agueda. The retreat from Salamanca was not made without losses of men and baggage. The capture of General Paget and one sharp combat on the Huerba, but there the pursuit stopped and the campaign was over. A little later the army went into winter quarters over a wide territory, and the man who was the soul of the war on the peninsula, ever active in so many and such diverse ways, began to meditate those final plans which brought his prolonged and mighty exertions to a victorious close. Although we have not been able to hold the two Castiles, he wrote to Dumouriez, November 30th, from Freneda, our campaign has not been a bad one, and we are in a position to make a good one next year. Such was his modest way of describing a great success. The circumstances of the hour were growing more and more propitious. Napoleon's gigantic Russian invasion had gone to wreck. On the day when Wellington flitted so deftly from Burgos, the French Emperor had just seen the last of Moscow, and at the moment when Wellington was writing the letter which has been quoted, Napoleon was dating his dispatches from villages on the right bank of the ice-laden Beresina, which he had crossed 3 days before. The full extent of his prodigious misfortunes was not then known in Freneda, but enough had been reported to render it certain that the genius of Napoleon would be taxed to keep a hold on Germany, and that he would have few resources or none to spare for Spain. Another fact which gave some little help was that the Cortes had sanctioned the appointment of Wellington to the post of commander-in-chief of the Spanish armies, and during the winter he visited Cadiz in order to make the arrangement as solid and useful as might be possible. Far greater in importance was the increased weight conferred on him at home by his victories and the evident fruits of his victories. He was raised to the rank of Marquess, thanked again by both houses, and granted £100,000. The opposition no longer spoke of him with contempt. Lord Grey, who, having objected to the vote of thanks proposed after Talavera, had handsomely retracted his earlier opinions when Massena was driven from Portugal, now joined Lord Wellesley in his attack on the government because they had not sufficiently supported their great general. As Wellington stood apart from politics and served his country, the wholesome change wrought at home by the magician's success increased still further his moral power, not only over the British, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, but over the enemy. Therefore, when he received reinforcements during the winter, especially in cavalry, he was able, under better auspices and on firmer ground, to prepare for the coming campaign. The awful disaster in Russia had placed the defenders and invaders of Spain on less unequal terms. The French army of occupation, diminished in number, yet still reckoned by the 100,000, was without a competent head, for Joseph had induced his brother to recall Soult, and Napoleon imposed on his subordinates in Spain tasks which a captain equal to himself alone might have been able to achieve. He underrated the obstacles, did not or would not understand that the political and military facts had become adverse to his cause, and that there was at hand a genius who could profit by the conjuncture. Wellington, indeed, was now to secure the reward of his long-tried patience and ever-active skill. During the spring of 1813 he set on foot a series of operations all over Spain and on her coasts, which occupied, bewildered, and paralyzed the French commanders, organized strongly his own army, which exceeded 70,000 men, framed a plan of campaign which the adversary could not or did not penetrate, and then, suddenly breaking in upon them where he was least expected, shook down the fabric of their power at one blow. The months of labour, the astute contrivances, the assiduous care which embraced small things as well as great, and the far-reaching application of sound business principles to the furtherance of his design must be digested in detail to be appreciated. Here we can only deal with the bold outlines of the fascinating story. The French armies were scattered between Toledo and the Pyrenees, expecting an attack but uncertain where the stroke would fall, when the Anglo-Portuguese army, quitting winter quarters, started forward into the heart of the disarray. Sir Thomas Graham, with 40,000 men, moved first, stealthily crossing the Douro at Oporto and Lomego, and working through the Trasos Montes in order to surprise the French on the Esla. When he was well forward, Hill brought up the right wing to Bejar, and the centre assembling in front of Ciudad Rodrigo, Wellington rode in from Freneda and joined that body. Both pushed out towards Salamanca, flanked by Spanish cavalry, and it is written that on passing the Agueda on May 22nd, the general rose in his stirrups, took off his hat, and cried, "Farewell, Portugal!" So the columns strode along, the French outposts falling back before them, and so well timed were the marches that both generals arrived together on the Tormes, where the Frenchman, Villatte, waited too long, and being overtaken near Santa Marta and Aldealengua, his troops suffered, and he lost 6 guns. That encounter was followed up by a march on the Douro at Zamora and Toro, whither Graham had not yet come. But by the end of the month his junction with the other columns was secured. For Wellington, leaving Hill in command, had passed over the Douro in a basket slung on a rope stretched from rock to rock, and his presence in Graham's camp supplied a stimulus which always told. Then the difficulty of crossing the Esla was overcome, and bridges being laid on the Douro, the whole army, 90,000 strong with 100 guns, was soon in line on the right bank of that river. As the troops were eager and hearty, and the leading good, A fortnight had sufficed to draw this mass together from widely separated starting points, and the result was a complete surprise to an adversary ignorant of Graham's march. The mighty array beyond the Douro seeming to have sprung out of the earth. The French, astonished and hesitating, abandoned Madrid and managed to hurry their divisions over the river and get well upon the high road to France. After a halt at Toro, the pursuers sprang forward on June 4th, and on the 7th they were over the Carrion. King Joseph was driven to Burgos, the Spaniards swarming on his flanks and the allies at his heels. He did not halt, but blowing up the castle of Burgos, hastened with his stores, his host of followers, his court and his treasure over the Ebro, holding Pancorvo and its forts to cover his position, hoping that he might be allowed to regain the lost initiative. Not so. Wellington, working by his left, swung over the Ebro far above Miranda, opened communication with Santander as a new base, and swept through and over the stony and rugged hills by roads and no roads which fairly turned the enemy's right, his soldiers on their arduous way meeting unexpectedly and beating 2 French brigades. Thus on the 18th, while Reille, who had suffered in that combat, held a position on the Bayas stream at Subijana, the main body of the French filed through the pass of Puebla into the valley of Vitoria, where, after a long race, it was brought to bay. For Reille, unable to stay on the mountain, went over the Zadorra on the 19th, and Wellington, using the following day to reconnoitre, framed his plan of battle. The Zadorra, flowing from the eastward until it reaches the hills, is there shouldered off abruptly to the south, and enters the Ebro through the defile of Puebla. Within the elbow formed by the river was the French position. The right was high up at the bridges near Arriaga and Gamara Mayor and Minor, not far from Vitoria. There Reille, the best French soldier on the field, held a position which guarded the high road through Tolosa to Bayonne. But the main body was posted on a traverse ridge 6 miles to the westward, its right resting on the Zadorra, where it bends to the south, its left upon the mountain running east from the Puebla defile. Behind Vitoria, blocking the royal road, were the military chest, the baggage, the equipages of the court, and the artillery parks. The army was diminished by a strong detachment sent with a convoy toward France, but General Clausel was approaching from the side of Logroño, and Foy, who was in Guipúzcoa, was ordered up to Vitoria. Those two, although Clausel came near, never reached the field. Having inspected the ground, and being always inclined to go forward and get close, he was candidated during his ride. Wellington resolved to direct Graham against Reille's troops at Gamara and Arriaga, send Hill through the Puebla defile to attack the left on the ridge, and lead his main body himself straight through the mountains upon the right and centre of the French line. The troops were in movement at daybreak on June 21st, 1813, but they had steep and rough ground to traverse, and the action did not begin until the forenoon, when Hill, having cleared the defile, pressed in upon the French left. At this time Wellington's divisions were over the hills and among the woods in the Zadorra valley, heading for the bridges, none of which had been broken. Away on the British left, beyond the visible spires of Vitoria, the smoke of Graham's guns rose above the trees, and their muffled roar was faintly heard. A peasant informed Wellington that the bridge at Tres Puentes was unguarded, and Kemp's brigade of the Light Division was instantly sent across, established close to the French line, and employed at once to fall on the foe up the river, and enable the 3rd and 7th Divisions to cross almost unopposed. Then the 4th advanced over the bridge of Nanclares, and thus the fight was developed on a broad front. Hill had gained ground on one side, Picton and Dalhousie on the other, while the sound of Graham's battle became more and more audible. The French line was shaken, and the king intent on retreat, when Wellington, who had ridden far to the front, seeing that a hill near the village of Ariñez, in the centre of the position, was barely guarded, himself took the 3rd Division, Picton riding at its head, dressed in a blue coat and round hat, led it at a running pace diagonally across the front of both armies, and carried the hill. The combat now raged along the ridges with great fury, for the French were fighting to gain time and form afresh to the rear. That time was not granted. The hills and villages were seized, and sweeping onward the Allies drove the enemy step by step through the fields and woods close up to Vittoria, and all the time Graham's artillery, thundering on their right rear, quickened their pace or steadied their resistance, for as the sound did not advance, it showed that Reille held his ground. The strife in front of Vittoria was fierce, desperate, and prolonged until the line was turned, and as the transport blocked the high road to Bayonne, Joseph was obliged to retreat on Pamplona. Reille all day defended his bridges, which were taken and retaken more than once, and saved the army, for he did not yield until the headlong pursuers from the main battle rushed in upon him. Then he ably drew off, hotly followed, and getting through Metauco in the darkness, joined the flying host on the road to Pamplona. Such, in brief, was the decisive victory at Vittoria. The enemy's loss of men, including prisoners, was hardly greater than that of the Allies, 5,000 or 6,000, but they lost 150 out of 152 guns, all their ammunition wagons, baggage, public and private, their provisions, transport animals, and 1,000,000 sterling of treasure. Jourdan's bâton, much jewellery, many pictures, and a mass of official records were taken, while the field was littered with the plunder which the king and his generals had endeavoured to carry away. The Swiss did not capture more when they surprised Charles the Rash at Granson in 1476, and took his camp and all that was his to the value of 3,000,000 crowns. While King Joseph retreated through the mountains to France, pursued by part of the light division, Wellington was intent on keeping him separated from Clausel, or snapping up that general if he gave a chance, and Graham went down the royal road to deal with Foix. Clausel gave no chance, but descending the Ebro to Saragossa, hastened thence northward, and regained his country by the pass of Jaca. In passing by Pamplona, the king reinforced the garrison, and Foix, before retiring through Tolosa, filled San Sebastian with good troops. None of the invading host, save Suchet, now remained in Spain, and he was, or thought he was, fully occupied by the insurrection and the Anglo-Sicilian army in Valencia and Catalonia. In order to secure a new base on the Biscayan coast, Sir Thomas Graham was ordered to invest and besiege San Sebastian, and Wellington disposed the rest of his army so as to blockade Pamplona and cover the siege operations. A fortnight after the Battle of Vittoria, the 4 posts of the allied army were on the French frontier, facing their redoubtable adversaries from the famous pass of Roncesvalles to the mouth of the Bidassoa. On the 1st day of July, Napoleon, in his quarters at Dresden, received disquieting news from Spain, referring apparently to Joseph's retreat from Burgos upon the Ebro. Whatever the scope of that intelligence, it was of a character to make him adopt a strong resolution. Addressing Soult, then in his camp, he said, "You will start before 10 o'clock this evening, travel incognito, reach Paris on the 4th, obtain the best information from the Minister of War and the Arch-Chancellor, stay not longer in Paris than 12 hours, but continue your route to take the command of my armies in Spain." Soult obeyed with such diligence that on July 12th he reached Bayonne and took on himself a burden too heavy for Joseph and Jourdan, and although the army was not in Spain, it still derived its title from that ill-used country. Napoleon, at this time fresh from his latest triumphs at Lutzen and Bautzen, hoped that his lieutenant would preserve the line of the Ebro and ward off danger from that quarter. An armistice had stopped hostilities in Germany, but it only covered preparations on both sides for a future and deadlier struggle. While providing Soult with nearly 100,000 men, the Emperor believed he could make head against the coalition. To Caulaincourt, his plenipotentiary at Prague, where the powers were conferring, he said, "Tell them that if they wish to prolong the armistice, I am ready. If they wish to fight, I am ready." And reporting what was the fact, that on July 24th, 25th really, Soult had marched on Pamplona. The English, he said, surprised by a prompt movement which they did not expect, were falling back before the Marshal's host. End of Section 11. Section 12 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Wellington's Offensive Campaigns, Part 2. And it was so. Sir Thomas Graham began the siege of San Sebastian on the 10th. On the 25th his troops were repulsed in an attempt to storm through the breaches, and Wellington, hastening to the camp, suspended all further operations, because while there he got news that Soult, whose advance was expected, had burst in on the right of the British line. Therefore Wellington hurried back to Lesaca and arrived in time to deal with his formidable adversary. Then ensued that exciting strife on the mountains and amid the valleys which can only be appreciated if studied in detail, for which here there is no space. In order to cover Graham's siege and the blockade of Pamplona, the greater part of the British army was posted on the north side of the central ridge, which crossed all the ravines and vales from Roncesvalles to Lecumberri. Thus the line was long, and by selecting the extreme right as the point of attack, Soult secured to himself the greatest advantages and the best chances of beating his opponent in fractions. He therefore cleverly assembled Clausel and Reille's divisions near Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and directed them upon the passes of Linduz and Ibagneta, while d'Erlon's divisions, starting from Espalette, assailed the centre under Hill. The advance was made on the 25th, the very day when Wellington galloped to San Sebastian, and it succeeded so far as to press back both fronts, yet not enough to master the ridge on the first day, for Cole and Byng stoutly resisting on the British right, and d'Erlon halting after a fierce combat on the Col de Maya, Wellington was able, when he rode to the front on the 26th, to direct all the troops within reach upon the valley of Lens, where they would be in communication with Picton, who took command on that side. So on the 27th the whole line was in full retreat. The French followed fast, but on that day Soult with Clausel and Reille's men, pouring through the Val Zumbiri, were stopped by Picton, who faced about on the hills near Pamplona. The same evening, when the French endeavoured to seize the heights above Zabaldica and Sororen, they were promptly repelled by Cole, and forced to form up in the narrow highlands between the Val Zubiri and the Val of the Lens. Then Wellington arrived. He had ridden down the Lens valley from Ostis, and had entered Sororen as Clausel was approaching along the hills. He wrote a dispatch on the bridge parapet which Lord Fitzroy Somerset, his sole staff officer at that moment, carried to Hill and Dalhousie, who were approaching from the left. Then he rode towards Villalba, and as his well-known form and face appeared, the troops sent up hearty cheers of welcome. It is related that Soult was pointed out to Wellington as he sat on his horse, separated from the Marshal only by a narrow gulf, and that the British captain then uttered some sentences which have become famous. "Yonder," he is reported to have said, "yonder is a great commander, but he is cautious, and will delay his attack to ascertain the cause of these cheers. That will give time for the 6th Division to arrive, and I shall beat him." The 6th had been told they must arrive at their destination, and he knew that they would obey. Thus, when night fell and a tempest shook the hills, both armies stood between the Guy and the Lens torrents, making ready for the morrow. On that day, the 28th, Soult's troops attacked with great hardiness, but, as foreseen, the 6th Division had come up on the British left, and the French were repulsed again and again, even when they had perseveringly climbed on to the rocky crest. When the evening came, Wellington's 16,000, though considerably diminished in number after the bludgeon work, as he called it, had victoriously thwarted the valorous onsets of nearly double their strength, and the main purpose of Soult was frustrated. For the British divisions marching in the mountains were nearer together than the French, the light division only being or seeming to be afar and in danger. Quiet prevailed on the 29th, but on the 30th Soult joined d'Erlon, who had come up to Lisasso and was about to fall upon Hill's weaker force. The French marshal formed a new plan of operations, which would have placed his army in Guipuscoa, but he reckoned without his host, for on that very day, while d'Erlon was fighting Hill, Wellington struck a direct blow at Rey and Clausel on the old ground of Sororen, defeated them utterly, pushed on in pursuit, compelled a great body under Foy to retreat on France by a separate line, and thus left Soult himself isolated, with only one pass open to him, that of Dona Maria. Over it he went, and though closely pursued, he halted in San Estevan. It was here that, except by one exit, he was surrounded. Wellington, watching from the hills, awaited the fitting moment to close on his opponent. Straggling was prohibited, no fires were permitted. But suddenly he saw 3 red-coated marauders, who had entered the valley, snapped up by 4 French gendarmes, and soon after the drums beat, and the enemy was seen in column of march, headed for Zumbilla and the bridge at Yanzi. The British followed, the Spaniards came down to the bridge, the light division appeared on the other bank of the Bidassoa, and the French, filing through the narrow ledge between the cliffs and the torrent, under a hot fire, turned off toward Echalar. From that point they were driven on August 2nd, and on the 3rd, after 10 days of march and battle, the French were again in their own frontier. The losses in both armies had been great, but the defeated French were the more heavily punished. In the combat near Echalar, Wellington was nearly captured as he was examining his maps. His forward habit constantly led him into peril, but he never grew more cautious either in action or on the march, and always rode where he judged his presence would be useful. He has been blamed for not, while his opponents were in disorder, at once pushing his advantages. On the spot he judged differently, and considered that San Sebastian must be reduced before he entered on so great an enterprise as the invasion of France. Besides, Suchet and Catalonia inspired him with misgivings. In the Spanish war he had never to reckon with only the enemy in his front. It was his duty and habit to survey the whole political and military field, which really embraced Germany as well as Spain, and follow that course which seemed more likely to secure solid and lasting results. Therefore he resumed the siege of San Sebastian. During the whole year he was not seconded by the government at home as well as he should have been, for not only did the Ordnance Office languidly comply with demands for guns and ammunition, but the Admiralty did not maintain such a squadron on the coasts of Spain and Portugal as would have enabled supply ships to sail when required, and might perhaps have prevented the French from pouring men and stores into the fortress by sea. When the battering trains did arrive, the complement of ammunition was not in quantity proportional to the guns, so that there was first delay and then grave neglect, and Wellington did not leave the Admiralty in doubt respecting his opinion of their shortcomings. The plan of attack was censured at the time, apparently on grounds justified by the results, but to say that the place was taken by accident is a perverse exaggeration. It was won by sheer valour, and the explosion which gave so decided an advantage to the assailants was one of a kind not uncommon in war. The siege was begun again on August 5th, when Soult had been chased to his frontier, but the real work could not commence until the 22nd, because the guns from home had not arrived. The assault was made on the 31st, and the garrison driven into the castle, where the stout governor, Emmanuel Rey, held out until September 8th, when his rocky refuge was a ruin. The operations were impressively dramatic, and gave full scope to the bravery of the Portuguese as well as to the heroism of the British soldier. But some hideous atrocities which followed on the storming, although they were perpetrated by a few, threw a dark stain on the whole, unjustly perhaps, yet inevitably, and the sack of San Sebastian figures as an indelible disgrace. Neither Graham nor Wellington could have prevented the shameful acts which filled them with rage, but both deeply resented and finally repelled the calumnies which, like a monstrous growth, sprang out of facts sufficiently horrible in their naked reality. The officers on duty did all they could to restrain and punish the offenders. Wellington's share in the siege was intermittent, but he had so much to do, and besides the business was Graham's, but he did more than once interfere, and 4 days after the assault he was on the breach in conversation with Colonel John Burgoyne, who had succeeded to the command of the Engineers when Sir Richard Fletcher was killed. The loss inflicted on the Allies in this murderous siege approached the total of 3,000 killed and wounded, and the garrison was reduced to one-half their original strength. At this price the general bought a fortress of the utmost value to him as a secure place for hospitals and magazines, although the value was impaired by the dreadful conflagration begun by the French as part of the defence, and perhaps enlarged by the plunderers. Unwilling to allow San Sebastian to fall without another attempt to delay, if not avert, its capture, Soult crossed the Bidassoa on the last day of August, when the stormers were vainly struggling to win the breach, and the shot from Graham's guns were smashing the curtain wall above them. He had made close and powerful combinations to break through the Allied line, and his columns did push up the huge spurs of the Peña de Haya mountain, but forewarned, Wellington was prepared and ready to repel the front attack. The French came on in 2 large masses between Irun and Vira. One, under Rea, was repulsed on the heights of San Marcial, where, stimulated by Wellington's voice and gestures, the Spaniards were prevailed upon to stand alone. The other, commanded by Clausel, after pushing up the steeps, was paralyzed by a strong demonstration on his left rear from the side of La Sacca. In the afternoon a tempest deluged hill and valley, staying the battle and converting the stream into a swollen torrent, and while the greater part of the French got back in safety, one brigade was caught at the bridge of Vira and lost its general. The stroke was heavy, but it failed to relieve San Sebastian. The aggregate losses of both sides exceeded 5,000 men. So well did each fight, and in the end Soult felt constrained to stand on the defensive for the future, and use the pick and spade to fortify the slopes and summits of the folded hills between the Nivelle and the Bidassoa. He had more than a month for preparation. There were 3 things which operated to hinder the advance of the Allies: the steadfastness of the governor of Pamplona, the state of the war in Germany, and the superiority maintained by the French on the east coast of Spain, where, although Suchet had retired to Catalonia and blown up the old walls of Tarragona, he still defeated Lord William Bentinck at Ordal, and held on to the province. But when Pamplona surrendered at the end of October, when the intelligence from Saxony showed that Napoleon was worsted by the Allied armies, when it seemed almost certain that Suchet would not act with Soult, the Field Marshal finished the plans for the invasion of France, which he had resolved to undertake as soon as San Sebastian fell. "I am waiting here, Lasaka," he wrote to his brother on September 12th, "till the animals of the pontoon train will be relieved from the work consequent on the siege, when I shall cross the Bidassoa," showing that even then his plan of movement was conceived. From Vira, October 31st, he wrote, "It is impossible that Napoleon can stand, and the Confederation of the Rhine is gone." At that time, however, his troops had entered France. The able manoeuvres which carried him over the frontier began on October 7th by the passage of the Bidassoa. Long prepared and preceded by movements designed to deceive his adversary when set in operation, they took Soult by surprise. For the Allies broke in upon his long line of earthworks, obstructions, and mountain crests, precisely where they were not expected. Calculating the time to a minute, the time being dependent on the tide, Wellington sent a strong column from Fuenterrabia and Irun over the river just above its mouth, poured a serried host from the heights of San Marcial and the bridge of Vera upon the centre and left, and fighting all day, not only mastered the low country toward the sea, but drove the French out of their strong works, thrown up to defend the rugged hills, and on the 8th captured and occupied the very summit of the great Rhune, the loftiest hill in those parts, so that the French were forced back into the fortified lines constructed on both banks of the Nivelle, and Wellington again proved to Soult that he could cross a river in the face of a large army. Another month elapsed in relative quiet, during which Wellington tendered his resignation of command over the Spanish army, justly indignant with the Spanish authorities, who shamefully neglected their troops in the field and broke their covenants with the Generalissimo. At the same time, a very able soldier, Sir John Hope, joined the army, where his presence was most welcome, the Field Marshal's 3 lieutenants being now Hope, Beresford, and Hill. Early in November another forward move was made, and on the 10th and 11th the Allies, skilfully directed, tumbled the French out of all their fortifications, drove and followed them over the Nivelle, taking 51 guns, all the field magazines, and many hundreds of prisoners. By the 12th, Soult was established in and about the entrenched camp of Bayonne, a series of formidable works on both sides of the Adour. Though he required every available sabre and bayonet for offensive operations, Wellington at this time ordered all his Spanish troops, except Morillo's division, into Spain as a punishment for their deeds of plunder and outrage in contravention of his proclamation, which he intended should be obeyed, promising protection to the persons and property of the French people. This evident proof of his good faith brought provisions to his camps, but the violence of the Spaniards and the want of money, always very pressing, prevented him from carrying out his great plans. Early in December, despite difficulties of all kinds, he once more assumed the offensive and effected the passage of the Nive above its confluence with the Adour. The work was finally done on December 9th, but as the Allied army was separated by the Nive, Soult thought he had a good chance of winning a victory by falling on the left under Hope, thus taking advantage of what is called Wellington's overconfidence. He therefore started forth, and during 3 days strove ineffectually to profit by the opportunity thus offered. Failing to defeat Hope, he turned upon Hill, and on this occasion had his best chance. But Hill was equal to the stress put on him, and Wellington, who had watched and sustained the battle with fresh troops, taking the offensive, Soult again thwarted, drew his main body over the Adour. The Allies lost many hundreds and had 5 generals wounded. The French loss was more severe, and at the end of the last day's fighting 3 German regiments passed into the camp of the Allies. Another period of comparative inactivity followed, comparative, for although the troops were quiet, their captain was incessantly occupied, devising modes of feeding them, wrestling with the foolishness of the Spanish, Portuguese, and British governments, even with the gold he received, coining Napoleons, because that money could be the more easily exchanged by his soldiers. His repeated and plain-spoken remonstrances had produced some change for the better in the Admiralty, and consequently in the co-operation of the Navy. Still, he had to resist plans suggested from home, and he always suffered from want of funds. But when the Allies had crossed the Rhine, and Napoleon had begun his inimitable though fruitless campaign of 1814, Wellington also pressed upon his able adversary, whose forces had been diminished to reinforce the Emperor, and yet remained within a few hundreds equal to those of the British Field Marshal. In February he was once more in motion, executing a plan which was not his least masterly conception. Intending to invest Bayonne, he boldly resolved to throw a great bridge over the Adour below the town, and to facilitate the project, assailed the French left, thus drawing Soult away from the fortified camp, while Sir John Hope and Admiral Penrose worked together to bridge the broad tidal stream. Repeated and successful manoeuvres and attacks between the upper course of the Nive and the Adour deceived and bewildered Soult, who receded farther and farther from the decisive point. Then Hope accomplished his daring enterprise with greater daring, and between the 24th and 25th of February, after severe labours, he mastered the river and invested Bayonne. By the time this great exploit was finished, Wellington had compelled Soult to retreat over the Gave d'Oléron, and even the Gave de Pin, on the right bank of which he halted to fight at Orthez. Beresford passed the stream some miles below, and moving up the right bank to Beitz, covered the passage of all the army at Bérinx, except Hill's 2 divisions, which were opposite the bridge of Orthez and threatened the French left. Soult, uncertain of the strength before him, formed a fresh line of battle, and on February 27th, instead of being, as he had designed, the assailant, found himself the defender. For some time he kept Beresford at bay on his right, repelled an attack on his left, and thought he was about to defeat his old opponent. If so, he was over sanguine. Wellington, who had been watching the conflict from an elevated central position on the site of a Roman camp, finding he could not break in on the French right wing, developed a powerful attack along the whole front, and sent the 52nd Regiment across a marsh to smite the exposed inner flank of the right wing. Hill at the same time ascended the river to find a point of passage, and by the time he was crossing at Souars, the combined onset organized on the Roman camp, especially the hardy march and fighting of the 52nd, had disordered and overthrown the enemy, who, finding himself worsted at all points and Hill menacing his rear, yielded the field, and only essayed a formation to cover the retreat. As Hill was now over on the Pau road, that line was gone, and Soult was obliged to flit away towards Saint-Sever on the Adour in order to preserve his communication with Toulouse. He succeeded by dint of rapid marching, breaking down as he moved the bridges on the many streams. In this battle the French lost 6 guns, and Wellington was wounded, being struck from his horse. Yet he speedily rose to his feet, and it is said laughed at Alava, who was hit in a soft part, always a source of mirth. The contusion, or the deep bridgeless rivers, perhaps both, stayed the rapidity of pursuit, and the next day all the French on the Saint-Sever road were over the Adour. Hill, moving on the right, had a sharp skirmish with Clausel at Aire, defeated him and seized his magazines. Those at Dax and Mont-Saint-Marsan also were captured. The French marshal, now cut off from Bordeaux, fearful of being driven into the Landes, and still hoping that Suchet might come to his aid, clung to the spurs of the Pyrenees and covered the roads to Toulouse. Wellington followed as far as the country about Aire, but there he halted for some days, having detached Beresford and 2 divisions to Bordeaux. The Bourbons were already in the field, but the general did not directly help them, being restrained from that course by his own government, and honestly stating the truth to the Bourbon partisans, who incurred his wrath when they endeavoured to force his hand. Finding Wellington inactive, Soult actually resumed the offensive on March 13th, pushing his divisions close up to Aire. That bold movement, however, did not succeed, for Wellington, who had got back Beresford and one of his divisions from Bordeaux, retorted on his adversary with such vigour that he was forced to fall back rapidly through Tarbes and Saint-Gaudens to his entrenched position at Toulouse. At this time the population of the districts through which poured the streams of warfare, far from rising in arms, did nothing to aid Soult, and brought provisions readily into the British camps, and they did this because they were scrupulously well treated and paid for all they supplied. The English general's policy, a French official wrote, and the good discipline he maintains, does us more harm than 10 battles. Every peasant wishes to be under his protection. That is decisive testimony, if any were needed, but it must be admitted that the Spanish divisions, sent back because they were guilty of outrage, yet some of which he was obliged to call up afresh, nearly effaced by their crimes the good feeling won by the general's noble conduct. The French peasants were tired of the long and exacting wars of Napoleon, and if they were not eager for the Bourbons, they were athirst for peace. Soult believed he could make good his strong post in front of Toulouse, for he had fortified the Mont Rave, a high ridge rising between the stream of the Aire and the canal on the eastern face of the town, while the entrenched suburb of Saint-Cyprien, in a loop on the left bank, defended the bridge over the Garonne. The Allies came up on that side, but in order to master the defences of Toulouse, after several tentative measures above, Wellington, keeping Hill before Saint-Cyprien, threw his bridges below, sent over all the other divisions, and cutting off Soult from Montauban, moved up the Aire into the narrow space between it and the French lines. That involved a flank march by 2 divisions under fire in order to reach and storm a height on the south. The troops endured the loss and carried the height, and although the Spaniards suffered reverses from assaulting the northern redoubts too soon, and Picton was repelled when he changed a false into a real attack, yet Beresford's divisions, the 4th and 6th, overpowered their foes, and charging along and through the works on the Mont Rave, obliged Soult to withdraw behind the canal. Yet he still held fast to the redoubts and bridges which defended and gave access to the Carcassonne road, his only available line of retreat. This was not done without much persevering fighting and always at great risk, but it was done. The French lost 5 and the Allies 4 generals, and several thousand men killed and wounded. Soult, fearing that he might be cut off altogether, withdrew from Toulouse on the night of the 11th, leaving 8 guns and his wounded to the conqueror, who the next day entered Toulouse. Here terminated the last act of Wellington's campaigns, begun in Portugal and finished in France. The sanguinary fight on the Garonne and the still later sortie from Bayonne were both subsequent to the abdication of Napoleon. That great event was virtually completed on April 7th, but not officially communicated to the Allied powers until the 11th, and of course could not be and was not known to Soult before the Battle of Toulouse. Nor would he recognize the fall of his emperor until an aide-de-camp brought the authentic papers from Napoleon himself. Then the British army, which had done so much, was dispersed, and its general travelled to Paris, where he arrived early in May to find himself Duke of Wellington. He was not allowed to stay long in the French capital, as his presence was requested in Madrid, where Ferdinand VII, of evil memory, had at length ascended the throne. To that monarch he gave honest advice, but it availed nothing. As a grandee of Spain, the Duke was entitled to keep his hat on in the royal presence, but he did not know it. During his stay in Madrid, the king showed himself to the people from a balcony of the palace, while his suite stood in a room behind. "The people, I believe," said Wellington to Croker, "and the king desired me to come forward, which I did bareheaded. Of course I should have done so anywhere else. The king immediately said to me, 'Be covered.' In the face of the people I could not at once bring myself to do it. But the people about us hastened to remind me that I was a grandee of the first class, and that I ought to have been covered." Fortunately, he had been engaged in more serious labours than a study of the privileges belonging to a Spanish grandee. Quitting Spain, he returned in June through Paris to England, having been abroad, steadfast in his country's service, without a break, for 5 years. What he did in that period we have seen. How crowded, how splendid the vista which runs back from the triumph of 1814 to the passage of the Douro in 1809. He had freed Lisbon the year before. Now he was set forth upon an enterprise in the success of which few believed, the liberation of Portugal, as a step to the liberation of Spain. But although Napoleon was the master of the continent, Sir Arthur Wellesley, when he began his stupendous task, saw the weak plates in the giant's armour, and believed firmly that he could pierce his vitals. Napoleon also detected at once the new power which had struck into the strife on the peninsula, and after Oporto he never ceased to tell his brother and his marshals that there was nothing in Portugal or Spain except the English. That was why his great lieutenant, perhaps his greatest, Massena, was sent to overwhelm the dreaded adversary. In the prince's path arose not only the soldiers of Busaco, but the lines of Torres Vedras, which revealed the most profound as well as the grandest conception of the time. The defence of those lines was the turning point in the war, and if the large consequences did not make the British ministers see that every man, gun, and guinea they could spare should be given to Wellington, it was because the ministers were not, nor could they be expected to be, the equals of the general, who alone at that time, scanning the future, foresaw what could be done. It was his patience, not less than his vast business knowledge and inventiveness, which helped him to win. He could wait as well as strike. His enemies called him cautious and timid, just as after Talavera they called him rash and adventurous. Yet in one winter he wrested from them 2 great fortresses, and made them the warders of the little realm he guarded. And when he had fixed himself firmly on his frontier, he marched into Spain, beating Marmont at Salamanca, as he had beaten Massena at Fuentes d'Anoro. Frustrated at Burgos, and followed in retreat by a great host, he showed Soult on the Tormes that he could manoeuvre as well as fight, and when once more in Portugal he had the satisfaction of knowing that his marches and battles had raised the siege of Cadiz and liberated the whole of Andalusia. Napoleon went to Russia and furnished the opportunity for which Wellington had fought and waited and watched. The next campaign carried his country's flag through the field of Vittoria to the crests of the Pyrenees, expelling from Spain all French armies save one on the east coast, and bringing the invasion of France within the reach of his arm. Nothing stopped him when he sprang forward, neither the fortified mountains, nor the deep and abounding rivers, nor the gallant soldiers of France, nor, at the end, the mighty entrenchments of Toulouse. We can see the shining results of 5 years' unremitting endeavour, and track the passage of the great captain from the rock of Lisbon to the shores of the Garonne. But what none can now fully realize are the vast and varied obstacles which beset his career and that of his matchless soldiers, and the ingenious devices which he contrived to lessen or overcome them. That which carried him through was not only his quality as a great and daring commander, but his honesty and uprightness as a man. His single aim was the service of his country, and he never swerved from that high standard throughout his long ordeal. He defined himself in regard to Spain as a concurrent sans ambition, adding, "All the world knew that I desired nothing but to beat the French out of Spain and then go home to my own country, leaving the Spaniards to manage theirs as they pleased." And we have seen that his endurance, moderation, and genius enabled him to achieve his desire. All through his life it will be found that duty and service were his guiding stars. He went home from the field of his infinite labours. Peace seemed to have closed a horrid era of bloodshed, yet only seemed, for the great conqueror, who was not without ambition, was brooding in his island of Elba how he might retrieve the throne he had solemnly renounced, if not the predatory empire which he had staked and lost. End of Section 12. Section 13 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. Waterloo, Part 1. Weary of war, yet proud of her own unyielding obstinacy in the prolonged contest, England heartily welcomed back a general who, like John Churchill 100 years before, brought home her colours, rent indeed in the tempest of battle, yet untarnished by defeat. If his strong character was not spoiled by popular applause, it was not the fault of his admirers. When he reached Westminster Bridge on June 23, 1814, the multitude dragged his carriage to the house of the Duchess in Hamilton Place. The next day Lord Bathurst hurried him to Portsmouth, where the Regent and his guests, the emperors and kings, were to witness a naval review. Returning, he took his seat as a peer, all his titles having been conferred since he sailed for Lisbon in 1809. He was thanked and congratulated on the part of the House of Commons by a committee of 15, as was the Duke of Marlborough, and on July 1st, clad in Field Marshal's uniform and wearing the Garter and the Golden Fleece, he thanked the House in person from a place within the bar on the left of the entrance, expressing his gratitude for the noblest gift that any subject had ever received, the grant of £400,000 voted on May 12th. A week later he carried the sword of state when the solemn thanksgiving for peace was rendered in St. Paul's, and in July the city gave him a banquet in the Guildhall. It was the high, yet not the highest tide of his popularity. That was to come, and we may infer from his letters that without being unduly elated, he received plaudits and honours alike as marks of the confidence felt in him by the princes and the people. But his judgment was not misled, nor was his manly simplicity of character impaired by this outburst of enthusiasm in all ranks. The Duke did not long enjoy a well-won period of rest at home. Always ready, as he told the House of Commons, to serve His Majesty in any capacity, the ministers speedily sent him as ambassador to the capital of France, precisely where his presence, one might have imagined, would be unwelcome to so many. On the road he took a military survey of Belgium, when his eye was attracted by the position at Waterloo in relation to the great lines of operation from the side of France, and he reported on the fortresses, which were the wrecks of the old barrier. The embassy to Paris was not productive of much advantage. Before the winter came, hostility was shown by the courtiers in the palace as well as the Bonapartists in the streets, and the ministers, fearing that some mischance might occur, were anxious to bring him home. They invented the pretext of sending him to command in America, but he steadfastly refused to be frightened away, and so far prevailed that Lord Liverpool at length gave him permission to select his own time of departure from a post he should not have been selected to fill. He said that as matters stood, the ministers could not allow him to quit Europe, for should anything occur, and he repeatedly pointed to its probability, "There is nobody but myself," he wrote, "in whom either yourselves or the country or your allies would feel any confidence." So he stayed on until the spring was near, and then quitted Paris to replace Lord Castlereagh at the Congress of Quarrelsome Sovereigns held in Vienna. Peace had come, but it rested on no solid basis, hardly on any basis at all. The conquerors all the winter were on the point of fighting for the spoil, and it was evident at an early hour that a new war could only be avoided by a series of compromises in the redistribution of territory. The measure of the peril is the secret treaty of alliance between Austria, France, and England to resist the northern powers who had extensive views on Saxony and Poland. When the Treaty of Vienna is criticized, it should never be forgotten that it was the price of peace in Europe, and that the ends sought by those who most fiercely denounced it could only have been attained, if at all, which is doubtful, by another 20 or 30 years of internecine war. The English government consented to, rather than concurred in the arrangements. They were obliged to take part, because without them there could have been no general settlement, and the penalty of refusal would have been battle and confusion. The issue out of the chaos was one not foreseen. Napoleon in Elba, affecting to be an homme mort, absorbed in the management of his household, his cows and his poultry, closely watched the course of events, and gradually prepared to make his spring. He was in communication, direct or indirect, with the discontented fragments of his old armies, the temper of which Wellington detected soon after he set foot in Paris. Dumouriez, as early as December, saw clearly into the facts when he said that Napoleon was not an homme mort, that he had been imprudently placed too near France and Italy, and that his spirit, reigning through and through the French army, still fed him with hope. Murat in Naples was also and always a more or less faithful ally of the deposed emperor, sure to stir if the latter showed signs of vitality. The movements of Murat indeed correspond with the ceaseless but careful preparations of his brother-in-law, and the King of Naples would not have been condemned for selfish haste had the Emperor Napoleon finally been victorious. The peace with the United States, terminating a war mainly begun and waged to serve Napoleon and the slave power, though based on a good pretext, was an event adverse to the plans meditated in the island of Elba, but it may have helped to precipitate their execution before the flower of the British army could be brought over the Atlantic. In other respects, the Emperor, who had good grounds to work on, judged that the conditions were favourable, and early in March the startled Congress learned first that he was in France, striding triumphantly toward the capital, and next that he was once more master of the resources of France. It was the military spirit detected by Dumouriez and noticed by Wellington which enabled Napoleon to march unopposed from the Gulf of Juan to the Tuileries. The miracle was wrought in his name, but it was the work of the army. "The marshals have recalled Bonaparte," said Ney to the prefect of Saintin, "because they were insulted by the men about the king. I know all that we have to fear," he added, "but I would rather be brayed in a mortar by Bonaparte than humiliated by fellows who never fought. Les émigrés ont encore perdu le roi." The statement was not true of all the marshals, but the words of Ney fairly paint the time. The Bonapartists may have conspired sur la place publique, but Napoleon knew well what armed support he could get when he embarked at Porto Ferraio, whence 3,000 years ago Etruscan Populonia drew its stores of iron. The sovereigns and plenipotentiaries at Vienna acted with promptitude and unanimity. On March 7th, when the courier brought Wellington the news from Florence that Napoleon had quitted Elba, they set their armies in motion toward France, and Metternich records that at Pressburg, a few days later, a regiment of cuirassiers defiled before Wellington on its way to the Rhine, which a short time before he had seen in Vienna on its road to quarters in Hungary. Wellington himself, as usual, looked to business and was at ease. "You will have seen what a breeze Bonaparte has stirred up in France," he wrote to his brother Henry on March 24th. "We are all unanimous here, and in the course of about 6 weeks, rather a sanguine estimate, there will not be fewer than 700,000 men on the French frontier. I am going to take the command of the army in the Netherlands, where we may note the Prince of Orange, if not General Kleist, was in great alarm. Hurry out everything, no time must be lost," the Prince wrote to Lord Bathurst on the same day, when Napoleon, reported to be at Lille, was actually in the Tuileries, where he had been installed 3 days. In Paris, shrewd observers at that moment, looking realities in the face, saw in the return from Elba war, implacable, immediate, universal, not only because Napoleon was a menace to the kings, but still more a menace to liberty. "Napoleon," said M. de Fontaine de Villemain, "Napoleon cannot endure this time because he no longer enjoys the natural conditions of life." His quarrel is now, said another, more with the peoples than their rulers. He might conquer at first, but he must fall in the end. One pulse throbbed through Europe, and in France there was neither hope nor enthusiasm outside the pale of the army. Napoleon, who had renounced his solemn renunciation of the French throne, was placed by the Congress hors la loi in the declaration adopted on March 13th, and the treaty of the 25th provided the means of enforcing the judgment of the public tribunal. It was after this instrument had been signed that Napoleon started for Brussels, where he arrived on April 4th. There he began the hard task of forming an army, managing the King of the Netherlands, the most difficult person to get on with I ever met, and knitting closely his relations with that portion of the Prussian army which had been brought on the ground. The English ministry found it impossible to furnish the promised quota of troops from any source, nor could they supply Wellington with the 40,000 British infantry and 15,000 British cavalry with which he would have been satisfied. Yet by degrees the trusty little host grew stronger as the transports poured into Ostend, and the continental troops assigned to him reached Belgium. But at the end of May he could only muster 105,000 men of varied nationalities for all purposes, while the British and Germans, upon whom he could thoroughly rely, formed little more than a third of the force available for service in the field. At the same period the Prussians had become a considerable mass, and both armies were in close communication. Napoleon, on regaining power, at once set about organizing an army on the basis of the troops he found afoot, but a large nominal force of all kinds only gave him some 130,000 men for the invasion of Belgium. He tried hard, but failed to gain time, and then, instead of waiting until the Allies were ready to attack, he quitted Paris on June 12th and fell upon his foremost foes. The quality of these three armies varied greatly. Napoleon's array was one of the best he ever led, being composed in the main of veterans. The Prussians were all of one nation; they also had fought in the War of Independence, and were animated by the fierce and lofty spirit which years of subjection had aroused. The Duke's army was composite: Britons, Hanoverians, Dutch, Belgians, Brunswickers, Nassauers, in no way equal to the hardy soldiers who stormed through the Pyrenees. "I command a very small British army, with a very large British staff, to which my superiors are adding every day," he wrote 3 weeks before the campaign opened. At an earlier period he begged the Horse Guards to refrain from forwarding more generals until they sent him troops. He thought the British government were afraid to touch the question of war, they had so unaccountably delayed their preparations. In the end he had to do his best with an army which contained only 30,000 British troops of all arms, including the German Legion, which was second to none. When Napoleon drove out of Paris on June 12th, the Allied forces in Belgium, the only part of the great alliance ready for battle, were posted at different points between Oudenarde on the Scheldt and Liège on the Meuse. The British on the right drew their supplies from Ostend and Antwerp, the Prussians from Cologne. Blücher had his headquarters at Namur, Wellington at Brussels, and each was prepared to assist the other by marching to the right or left, or concentrating on the centre, should that be assailed. Now through that centre ran the high road to Brussels, cut almost at right angles at Quatre Bras by the transverse line of communication between Nivelles and Namur, which secured the connection between the two armies. Wellington's troops, except the reserve in and near the Belgian capital, were all to his right or west of the central highway, and Blücher's on the left, except that Zieten's corps was at Charleroi, and extended beyond it up the Sambre toward Maubeuge, and therefore in front of the British troops near Mons. Napoleon, noting this distribution, resolved to strike at the line of junction, hoping that by long swift marches he might interpose a mass between the two, defeat each in succession, or drive them to unite, if they could, beyond Brussels. It was a bold project, but one which imposed on his troops labours greater than they could perform, and in addition allowed nothing for accident or fortune, requiring for success the exact and punctual fulfilment of its exorbitant demands. Wellington did not divine, as it is called, the plan of this master in the practice of war, and thought to the end of his days that Napoleon might have done better, and this misjudgment, though it did not prevent his success, is paraded as a proof of his inferiority as a general. Napoleon therefore started with a great advantage. He was going to strike where he was least expected, and by skilful management he was able to concentrate his army almost, though not quite unobserved, just within the French frontier, opposite the supposed gap or weak place through which he intended to break. His departure from Paris was known at Namur and Brussels. Zieten's troops, who kept a vigilant watch, saw the red flush of the French bivouac fires above the forest, and the Allies were alert and ready to move. Wellington did not issue any order or change the distribution of his divisions when he knew only that Napoleon was on the frontier, but he was ready to march to his left just as Blücher was ready to close to his own right. The difference was that Wellington desired some definite indication that the Emperor was not about to strike at his communications with England, whereas Blücher, who had no need to fear for his line of supply, was eager at the first warning to take up a position for battle. So it fell out that on the night of the 14th, when Napoleon's orders were actually issued, Blücher directed Zieten, if attacked, to retire fighting on Fleurus, and his 3 other corps to concentrate behind it at Sombref. But on the 14th, no information whatever reached Brussels which went farther than the fact that Napoleon was on the frontier. The reason for the difference is that the Prussian outposts touched the French army, and therefore the intelligence from the front went swiftly to Namur and slowly to Brussels. The situation strongly illustrates the grave danger attending the operations of Allied armies acting in concert from divergent bases under independent commanders. One commander-in-chief would have known all that was to be known, and have guided himself accordingly. While the Prussian corps were moving on the 15th from Liège, Namur, and Ciney toward the chosen field of Ligny, not a man stirred from the British cantonments. The French at dawn sprang forward in 3 columns, Reilly and d'Erlon down the Sambre, Vandamme, Lobau, and Napoleon direct from Beaumont upon Charleroi, and Gérard from Philippeville upon Châtelet. Though Ziethen forgot to break down the bridges, still he ably handled his retreating troops, delayed the enemy, kept up a bold front, and at eventide remained in possession of Fleurus. Accidents and misunderstandings for which Napoleon did not allow actually occurred, and at night the farthest points attained by his leading troops were Frasnes, Wagner, and Lamboussard. The rear extended to the right bank of the Sambre near Charleroi, and to the left bank of that river opposite Châtelet. The Emperor was satisfied with the day's work, and, if we may judge from his language, retired to Charleroi in the confident belief that the next day his troops would be in Brussels. Not the faintest intimation that anything unusual had occurred in the valley of the Sambre reached the British headquarters until 3 in the afternoon. For 11 hours there had been steady marching and fighting within 40 miles of Brussels and 10 miles of the British outposts at Frasnes, yet not a whisper of conflict was heard by Wellington. The Prince of Orange rode in from Nivelles and brought to the Duke about 3 o'clock a report that some skirmish or hostile movement had happened at Toulon, and a very little later General Muffling received a dispatch from Namur giving the same or similar intelligence. Upon that Wellington would not act decisively. He awaited a messenger from Mons, but he issued orders for all the divisions to concentrate at fixed points and stand prepared to march. Some time before midnight direct information came from the outposts of Mons, all there being quiet, that the French attack was directed upon Charleroi, where the infantry fire was very hot, and then he sent out orders for the troops to march by Nivelles, Braine-le-Comte, and Enghien, that is, from right to left, toward the scene of conflict. The reserve was to march from Brussels by Waterloo and Genappe. At midnight the Duke called on Muffling to tell him what he had done, so that Blücher might be informed. "The numerous friends of Napoleon here will be on tiptoe," he said to the German general. "The well-intentioned must be pacified. Let us therefore go to the Duchess of Richmond's ball and start for Quatre Bras at 5 a.m. The remark and the action are alike characteristic of one whose equanimity rarely broke down, and never in moments of peril. He had done all he could when his orders were issued, and considering how strong the French, or rather the Bonapartists, were in Belgium, he was wise when he showed his serene and cheerful countenance at a ball destined to be famous. In the morning he set out for the front, and near Waterloo passed the reserve, then halted and eating their breakfast, and riding onward reached Quatre Bras around 11. Finding that the French were only skirmishing with the outposts toward Frasnes, he sent an order for the reserve to march from Waterloo, and then rode off by the Namur road to the Prussian position, which he entered by the right rear, and joined Blücher at the windmill of Bussy, between Ligny and Brie. There he undertook to give the Prussians direct aid, providing he was not attacked himself, but from his own observation and the reports of Sir Henry Harding, he gravely doubted whether the Prussians would be able to escape a defeat, and when he got back about 3 o'clock to Quatre Bras, he saw enough to convince himself that he also would have a hard task to maintain his ground. At this moment, when the struggle on both fronts had begun, when the sound of Napoleon's battle was audible plainly at Quatre Bras, and Ney's onset had become severe and continuous, we may briefly sketch the general situation. Blücher had concentrated 3 corps at Ligny, and would have had 4, but for one of those accidents which are not infrequent in war. The Emperor, in error at first respecting the strength of the Prussians, he called them a body of troops. As soon as he was better informed, brought up 2 corps and the guard, keeping Lobau in reserve. On the Brussels road, Ney had 2 corps, but it was not until about 3 o'clock that the whole of one of them, Reille, was up to the front, while the other, d'Erlon, the victim of error and zeal, wandered between the 2 armies all day, useless to either. Wellington's divisions, except 2 Dutch-Belgian brigades present on the field, were all on the march, and on their arrival he depended to frustrate Ney. Muffling, seeing the state of affairs on the spot, had taken care to let Blücher know that no help could come to him from his ally. On his return from Bussy, the English general found the Prince of Orange contending with a force superior in all arms, yet not strong enough to seize Quatre Bras. The Duke's presence gave new life to the battle, and when Picton's division, followed by the Brunswickers and Van Merle's Belgian horse, arrived, he took the offensive, pushing forward right up to the edge of the farm of Gemiancourt. Ney, reinforced by the rest of Reille's corps and part of Kellermann's cavalry, violently retorted, and in the charge which partially broke into spray before the squares, Wellington ran the risk of death or capture. But he leaped his horse over the 92nd Highlanders lining the ditch on the Namur road, while his gallant pursuers, cut up by the infantry fire, were killed or driven off. Ney was further reinforced by more guns and cavalry, and Wellington's brigades continued to arrive in parcels. The Marshal was always superior in horsemen and cannon, but after 5 o'clock his opponent had larger numbers of foot. Holding firmly to the crossroads and the highway to Namur, Wellington became the stronger as the day waned, and when the Guards emerged from the Nivelles road and the Allies pressed forward, Ney, who had no fresh troops, was driven back, and his antagonist remained at sundown master of the whole field of battle. The position was maintained, but the cost was great, for there were no fewer than 4,600 killed and wounded, more than half being British soldiers. The thunder of the cannon to the eastward had also died away, but none knew as yet at Quatre Bras how Blücher had fared at the hands of his redoubtable foe. Wellington, who slept at his headquarters in Genappe, was on the field and scrutinizing his outposts at daybreak on the 17th. Soon after came a report, confirmed a little later, that the Prussians had retreated on Wavre. Their rear guard had remained all night near the French, and when they retired by Tilly and Gentines, their foes missed all trace of them. Napoleon had a belief that Blücher would retire upon Liège, which caused him at a late hour in the day to dispatch Grouchy to that side, and thus touch was lost. While the French were cooking and Napoleon was pondering, definite intelligence was brought to Wellington, who, learning for certain that Blücher was at Wavre, promised to stand fast himself at Mont-Saint-Jean and fight, if Blücher would support him with 2 corps. The intrepid Marshal replied that he would come with his whole army, and Wellington got the famous answer before night. Thus was made between generals who thoroughly trusted each other that combination which led to the Battle of Waterloo. It was no chance combat, but the result of a deliberate design, rendered capable of execution, even when Blücher was wounded, by his resolve to retreat upon Wavre, and by Napoleon, who acted on conjecture that the Prussians would hurry toward their base at Liège. The morning at Quatre Bras was peaceful. The Allies cooked their food before starting forward. Wellington, it is said, lay down for a moment and snatched perhaps a little sleep. There was no stir in front or on the exposed left flank, and covered by a strong display of horsemen, the Allied divisions tramped steadily toward Mont-Saint-Jean. Napoleon had hesitated long before he took any decision, and when about midday Ney's horsemen showed on the highway, and Napoleon's leading squadrons were approaching from Ligny, there was no force near Quatre Bras except cavalry. The Duke was still to the fore. As the French came on, the heavy and light brigades retired over the Dyle by fords or through the defile of Genappe. The French horse followed, and beyond Genappe essayed a charge, at first with some success, but soon they were overborne by the first Life Guards and then held aloof. So the retreat continued all day. A thunderstorm, so often a precursor of Wellington's battles, deluged the fields with rain, and pursuer and pursued struggling through the mire, were drenched to the skin by nightfall. Napoleon was with the light horse in advance when they halted at La Belle Alliance, and fired a few guns which were answered from the opposite ridge. D'Erlon, Lobau, and the guard had come up, but Reille was still at Genappe, and did not rejoin until the next morning. End of Section 13. Section 14 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. Waterloo, Part 2. The results of 2 days' warfare may be thus summed up. Napoleon had inflicted a defeat, yet not a decisive defeat, upon the Prussians, who escaped from his ken to Wavre. He had then, at a late hour on the 17th, detached Grouchy with 33,000 men to follow them, and Grouchy at night from Gembloux reported that they had retired in 3 directions. Moving himself in the afternoon, Napoleon, uniting with Ney, had pursued Wellington to Mont Saint-Jean, and slept in the comfortable belief that he had separated the Allies. At that very time, Wellington, who had assembled his whole force except 17,000 men, including the British brigades who were posted at Hal and Tubize, was in close communication with Blücher, and intended on the 18th to stop Napoleon by delivering battle, and to hold him fast until Blücher could cut in on his right flank and rear. Thus it was the Allies who were united practically, and the French army, which was separated into 2 groups, unable to support each other. Considering that in the estimation of a modern school of English military critics, Wellington and Blücher were second- or third-rate generals, and that the former roughly pitched his estimate of Napoleon's presence at 40,000 men, the facts on the evening of the 17th tell rather in favour of second-rate generalship. But the truth is that the military critics, after years of investigation and deep study, possess a knowledge not vouchsafed to either Napoleon or Wellington, and its fruit is the kind of judgment après coup which is supposed to be so instructive and is often so unjust. What would Napoleon or Wellington or both not have given for 1/10 of the exact information which enables criticism to make use of the advantage which its enlarged horizon affords, that is, to judge the generals by a series of facts and results which were not and could not have been known to them at the time? The tempest which burst over the retreating columns on the 17th followed them to their bivouacs and raged all night, and did not cease until late on the fateful Sunday. Wellington, mounting his faithful Copenhagen at break of day, rode from the village of Waterloo to the field, where the armies on both sides, protected by watchful sentries, were still contending with the mischiefs inflicted by the storm. The position was the crest of a gentle slope, stretching from Smohain to the Nivelles road, having upon and in advance of its right the chateau, garden, and wood of Hougoumont, and in the centre, where the Charleroi road cut through the little ridge, the farm of La Haye Sainte. Both these posts were occupied, but the latter, unfortunately, not so solidly as Hougoumont. The greater portion of the Allied army, forming the right and centre, was on the west, and the left along the Wavre cross road on the eastern side of the highway. Behind Hougoumont the ground trended back toward Braine-l'Alleud and Meurbraine, and here the reserves were posted. It was indeed, combined with Hougoumont, the storehouse and strength of battle. The front, about 2 miles long, was held by infantry and guns. The cavalry, except 2 light brigades on the extreme left, were in rear on the gentle northern slope, and invisible from the French position. Behind all were the Dutch-Belgian cavalry, the Brunswickers, and after the action had begun, Lambert's British brigade from Ghent. The position was well filled by the 69,000 men of all arms and 156 guns which were present that day. Napoleon, who slept at the farm of Cailloux, and who had been out on foot to the front during the night, was also early in the field, and glad of the gift which he thought fortune had placed in his hands. When Rey had joined him from Genappe, he had 72,000 men, all admirable soldiers, and 240 guns with which to engage in combat, and he reckoned that the chances were 90 to 10 in his favour. He mounted his charger, reconnoitred his opponent's position, and then gave the orders which, promptly and finally obeyed, disclosed the French array. There were 2 lines of infantry, 2 of heavy cavalry, backed by a reserve of both arms, and finally the imposing masses of the Imperial Guard. The front stretched from Frischemont across the Charleroi to the Nivelles road, and one may imagine with what admiration and interest Wellington and his officers watched the formation of that grand example of order and power, and listened to the outcries which greeted the Emperor when he rode along his majestic lines. It was now nearly 11 o'clock, and although his opponent knew it not, Wellington had got news of the march from Wavre of Bülow, whose leading troops were actually at that time close to the wood of Saint-Lambert on the French right, while Grouchy was at Sarles-les-Wallins between Gembloux and Wavre. It is not practicable here to give a full account of the Battle of Waterloo. We can only describe its broad outlines. The first gun was fired about 20 or 30 minutes past 11, and preluded a dashing and sustained attack on Hougoumont, which failed to carry the house, garden, or orchard, but did gain the wood. It was probably intended to divert attention from the attack on the left and centre, which Ney, massing his guns opposite the British left, was preparing to execute. Wellington watched and in some measure controlled the fight for Hougoumont, and then rode off to the centre, taking post at a solitary tree which grew near the Charleroi road above La Haye Sainte. Ney, at 1:30, sent forward the whole of d'Erlon's corps, and although some of them pushed up close to and over the Wavre road, stormed the orchard of La Haye Sainte, and took the Papelotte farm, yet at the critical moment Sir William Ponsonby's Union Brigade of horse charged into the French infantry, already shattered by the fire of Picton's troops, and the net result of the combined operation was that 2 eagles and 3,000 prisoners were captured, while nearly all that number of killed and wounded remained on the ground. On the other side of La Haye Sainte, the Household Brigade, led by Lord Anglesey in person, charged in upon and routed a large body of French cuirassiers. The grand attack thus completely failed, and the centre, like the right, remained intact. It was just before this combat began that Napoleon saw something like troops towards Saint-Lambert, and dispatched 2 brigades of light cavalry to reconnoitre. A Prussian staff officer was caught beyond Planchenoit, and from him came the unexpected and unwelcome information that the whole Prussian army was approaching, and after the defeat of d'Erlon, Napoleon detached Lobau's troops to cover his right, the Imperial Guard moving up from Rossomme to take his place. So that the 2 heavy blows came almost together, and the force pressing on Wellington was reduced by more than 10,000 men, the first fruit of the steady Prussian advance. The signs of danger on his right flank, the punishment of d'Erlon's corps, the ineffectual attempt upon the British Guards in and about Hougoumont, were followed by a kind of pause, and the combat reverted to cannonading and skirmishing. But toward 4 o'clock Napoleon, increasing the fire of his artillery, threw forward a mass of cavalry, 40 squadrons, and then began that series of reiterated onsets of horse which lasted for 2 hours. Their advent was foreseen, and the infantry west of the Charleroi road went at once into squares and oblongs, a form devised by Major, afterwards Sir James Shaw Kennedy, so that the horse which rode through the batteries in the crest wasted themselves in vain against the intrepid infantry. Twice they were driven down the slope, and the third time, when they came on, they were strengthened by Kellermann and Guillot, until they reached a force of 77 squadrons, or 12,000 men. But these also were repulsed. The British horse, what remained of them, charging when the French were entangled among the squares, and disordered by the musketry and guns. 4 times these fine troopers charged, yet utterly failed to penetrate or move a single foot battalion. but some time before the final effort, Ney, by a fierce attack, got possession of La Haye Sainte, and thus, just as the cavalry were exhausted, the French infantry were established within 60 yards of the Allied centre. And although the Emperor was obliged to detach one half of his guard to the right, because Blücher had brought into play beyond Planchenoit against Lobau nearly 30,000 men, still the capture of La Haye Sainte was justly regarded as a grave event. Wellington, during the cavalry fight, had moved 3 brigades on his right nearer to Hougoumont, and had called up Chassé and his Belgians to support them. And it was a little before this time that he cried out to Brigadier General Adam, "By God, Adam, I think we shall beat them yet." A little later, Shaw Kennedy, in some trepidation, rode up to the Duke to report that the centre of the line was open, for the Hanoverians had been wasted away by the ceaseless fire. This very startling information he received with a degree of coolness, and replied to with such precision and energy as to prove the most complete self-possession. He said to Kennedy, "I shall order the Brunswick troops to the spot, and other troops besides. Go you and get all the German troops of the division to the spot that you can, and all the guns that you can find." The Duke himself led forward the Brunswickers. The Hanoverians and Nassauers rallied. Vivian's cavalry rode up from the left, where Zieten's advance was in sight. The danger passed away, and Wellington rode back to the rear of the Foot Guards. The crisis of the battle had come for Napoleon. Unable, after 8 hours' conflict, to do more than capture La Haye Sainte, hardly pressed by the Prussians, now strong and aggressive, owing such success as he had obtained to the valour and discipline of his soldiers, the Emperor delivered his last stroke, not for victory he could no longer hope to win, but for safety. He sent forward the last 10 battalions of his guard to assail the British right, and directed the whole remaining infantry force available to attack all along the line. The Guard marched onward in 2 columns, which came successively in contact with their opponents. Napier's guns and the British Guards, who, rising from the ground, showed across the head of the first column, fired heavily, and charging drove them in confusion back toward La Belle Alliance, and the second column, struck in flank by the musketry of the 52nd and 95th, were next broken by a bayonet charge and pursued by Colonel Colborne to and beyond the Charleroi road. As Zieten's Prussians were falling upon the French near Papelotte and Pire and Bülow, wrestling with the Imperial Guard in Planchenoit, Wellington ordered the whole of the British line to advance. The cheers arising on the right, where he was, extended along the front and gave new strength to the wearied soldiers. He led the way. As he neared the Charleroi road, the riflemen, full of peninsular memories, began to cheer him as he galloped up. But he called out, "No cheering, my lads, forward and complete your victory." He found that good soldier Colborne halted for a moment before 3 squares of the rallied Imperial Guard. "Go on, Colborne," he said. "Better attack them. They won't stand." Nor did they. Wellington then turned to the right, where Vivian's light cavalry were active in the gloom, and we next find him once more with the 52nd near Rossomme, the farthest point of the advance, where that regiment halted after its grand march over the battlefield. Somewhere on the highway he met Blücher, who had so nobly kept his word, and it was then that Gneisenau undertook to chase the fugitives over the frontier. The French, or perhaps we should say the Napoleonic army, was destroyed, and the power which its mighty leader had built up on the basis of its astonishing successes was gone forever. Wellington returned to the village of Waterloo that night, and as he dismounted, after having been so many hours in the saddle, his trusty Copenhagen, still fresh, gave a playful kick, remembered by his master in after years. How he felt after his well-won triumph has been often recorded. The man who has been lightly accused of having a cold heart wept bitterly when the strain of duty was relaxed, and he saw the list of killed and wounded. What can better illustrate the iciness of his nature than the expressive saying drawn from him by Waterloo, that nothing is worse than a victory except a defeat? or the manly pathos of his letters to the relatives of his dead friends. But there was nothing of the actor about him, and that defect, if it be one, is mistaken for cold insensibility by the lovers of the theatrical element in daily life as well as in war. Dr. Home found him in bed early on the morning of the 19th. He had, as usual, taken off his clothes, but had not washed himself. As I entered, he sat up in bed, his face covered with the dust and sweat of the previous day, and extended his hand to me, which I took and held in mine, whilst I told him of Gordon's death, and of such of the casualties as had come to my knowledge. He was much affected. I felt the tears dropping fast upon my hand, and looking toward him, saw them chasing one another in furrows over his dusty cheeks. That is a picture of private life, and it is not the only example of Wellington's genuine tenderness of heart, exhibited in the quiet days of peace as well as on the morrow of a tragic victory. What was his share in the supreme triumph achieved on the 18th of June, 1815? After years of eager investigation, it has been discovered that he should have fortified and garrisoned the farm buildings of La Haye Sainte with more care, and that he should have summoned Colville's 2 British brigades from Hal. These were the 2 heinous faults which minish his renown. Although committing them, he still won the day. Next, it is said, not however by the same order of minds, that he owed his success to the Prussians, certainly just as the Prussians owed their success to the British. The latter had been fighting stiffly for 5 hours before a Prussian shot was fired, and they fought on for 9 hours. But that was the bargain. Wellington was to run the great hazards of a battle long enough to bring the Prussians into action, and he redeemed his pledged word not less assuredly than Blücher, a worthy comrade, redeemed his, not merely by fighting, which came later, but by pushing forward Bülow's leading troops, which compelled Napoleon to detach Lobau as early as 2 o'clock. The full stress of the Prussian battle was not developed until 6 o'clock, and even then the defeat of the Imperial Guard preceded the capture of Planchenoit. But why dispute over shares of glory when there is so much for all? It is not necessary to follow the Allied armies in their march on Paris, and it may be sufficient to say that on July 3rd, 15 days after the rout of Waterloo, hostilities ceased, Paris capitulated, the French army retired beyond the Loire, and on the 8th the Bourbon king entered the capital of France. Wellington had done all he could to restrain the anger of Blücher, who wished to hang Napoleon if he caught him, and blow up the bridge of Jena. The Emperor fled to Rochefort and the Bellerophon, escaping from Blücher to the perpetual exile of St. Helena, and Wellington rescued the bridge from destruction by reason and good management. To his great influence also France was indebted for the slight territorial changes made in her frontier. Practically his active military life ended on July 3rd, 1815, but he sojourned in France 3 years longer in command of the Army of Occupation. During that period he was requested to adjust, and did adjust, the many grave questions arising out of claims on France and counterclaims by the French. He reduced the amount against her by nearly 1/4, and finally, although adverse to his own personal interests, he persuaded the Allied sovereigns to terminate the occupation, which by treaty might have continued for some years. He never afterwards commanded an army in the field. His career, as a man of action, was over. And now we may glance back on that career and ask whether it is or is not the career of a great captain. The question is not so foolish as it looks, because high authority has recently denied him a place in the foremost rank of commanders. Lord Wolseley has declared that Wellington cannot be placed in the first line of generals because he did not secure, or even try to secure, the affection of his soldiers. Certainly that never was the motive of his conduct. He had a totally different idea of the duty alike of citizen and soldier. That idea he always tried his utmost to realize, and it was not to make himself beloved, but to perform his task faithfully, and if possible, which was not easy, make others perform theirs. But if he was not adored like Napoleon, he was loved by the men he led so well, for if not, Why did Napier print that truthful and touching dedication which stands on the first page of his immortal book? "This history," he wrote, "I dedicate to your Grace, because I have served long enough under your command to know why the soldiers of the 10th Legion were attached to Caesar. No troops ever followed any general with more alacrity, stood fast with more unconquerable determination, or at his word started joyously forward into more deadly perils than the British and even the Portuguese soldiers of Wellington's armies." Lord Wolseley also asserts that if Napoleon had been the man he was at Austerlitz, he would have won the Battle of Waterloo. It is a pure hypothesis, and about as reasonable as one which might be framed thus: if Soult or Clausel instead of Arabi had commanded the Egyptian army in 1882, Sir Garnet Wolseley would not have won the Battle of Tel el Kebir. What is the value of criticism which alters all the conditions on one side and does not venture to alter them on the other? Napoleon and Wellington and Blücher fought out their fight in the circumstances existing between the 14th and 19th of June. We can only judge them by the light of those circumstances. All else is pure fantasy, and if the greatest general is he who makes the fewest mistakes and does not wage war on conjectural grounds, then Wellington was the greater on the fields of Belgium, for incontestably he made fewer mistakes and acted on fewer and less dangerous conjectures than his mighty antagonist. It is an idle controversy. The intellectual greatness of Napoleon is as manifest as his selfishness and freedom from the fetters of moral principle, but it was the radical vices of his nature which rendered his vast, we might say supreme intellect of no avail, and sent him to finish his turbulent life in the dreariness of exile. That form of intellectual activity which is called military genius is, when free from the restraints of all moral principle, a curse to mankind, and that will be an ill day for England when her generals come to prefer and adore such a form, for it makes the soldier of genius master of the state for personal objects, instead of being what he should be, the servant alike of the state and of the loftiest idea of duty. Wellington throughout his life used his abilities, call them talents or genius, not to magnify himself, but to serve his country according to his lights. If he is not entitled to rank with the foremost, to be not the greatest, but among the few great captains, it would be interesting to know in what military greatness consists. He succeeded in all he undertook. His Indian career alone presents a model of what a soldier should be, and should have exempted him from the foolish charge of being timid and overcautious, wanting in vigor and decision. We may be allowed to measure a man's genius, if that is the correct word, by the relations which his means bear to the ends he attains. Except Frederick II and Bonaparte in Italy, no generals in modern times have performed so much as Wellington with such scanty and uncertain resources. We have also to remember his boundless confidence, his inexhaustible patience in gloom as well as sunshine, and imagine, if we can, the kind of courage it required to face and overcome the endless obstacles raised by the British, Portuguese, and Spanish governments. If we adopt for once the practice of indulging in suppositions, let us ask what might not Wellington have been able to accomplish had he possessed, like Napoleon, absolute command over the wealth and manhood of England, Spain, and Portugal, instead of being obliged to beg for a small army of Britons, deal as best he could with the Regency at Lisbon and the Cortes at Seville or Cadiz, and perform in turn all parts, civil as well as military, which the exigencies of the movement or the paucity of competent men demanded from day to day. Quite apart from the crowning event of Waterloo, there is ample room in the Indian and Peninsular campaigns of Wellington to give him a place among the foremost warriors. With a little army, says Charras, he did great things, and that army was his work. He should remain, and he will remain, one of the grandest military figures of this century. It is a just verdict, and we heartily trust that, regardless of party and faction and self-interest, England's generals, and for reasons as valid, whether they be styled men of genius or men of talent, will always deserve to be ranked with Wellington as the servants of duty and their country. End of section 14. Section 15 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. Diplomatist and Statesman, Part 1. Before Wellington sailed from the Continent in the autumn of 1818, he had accepted the office of Master General of the Ordnance, with a seat in Lord Liverpool's cabinet. The England to which he returned was neither peaceful nor prosperous. She was exhausted by the long war, her rulers increased the distress by pursuing selfish objects, and it is not surprising that her people were riotous and discontented. Happily the Master General was not called upon to take an active part in maintaining order, but his advice was sought and given. He busied himself in improving his estate at his own cost, having a profound conviction, on which he always acted, that property has its duties as well as its rights. He spent his entire rental upon the land from which it was derived, draining and fencing, building new cottages, providing large gardens — he held that a labourer should have 1 acre of land — and promoting the comfort of his tenants to such a degree as to draw praise from censorious Cobbett himself. In dealing with his office, he unearthed the arrangements of James II, a weak fellow, but a good man of business. Finding they were excellent, the Duke brought the department back very much to what he had made it, a remarkable fact preserved by Lord Stanhope. The accession of George IV in 1820 brought to a head the long-standing quarrel between that personage and his wife. The sins of both were notorious, but the new king was so unpopular that the people, including all ranks, made a heroine of the Queen. With her the Duke had no sympathy, but he disapproved of the proceedings initiated behind the backs of his ministers by the king, and only tacitly acquiesced in those pursued in Parliament. At a critical moment, when the bill of pains and penalties had been read a third time by a small majority, and not passed but postponed for 6 months, he submitted a memorandum to the king, pointing out the peril of pushing the matter further. If it were pushed, inquiry by both houses was inevitable, an inquiry, he boldly said, in which not the Queen, but your Majesty, yourself, and your English and Hanoverian servants, and the servants of the Duchy of Cornwall, and those employed by them, will be put on their trial. That memorandum was effectual apparently, but nothing more was done, and the king did not even try to change a ministry which failed to satisfy his anger. The Duke was made Lord High Constable, and as such took part in the coronation. It is commonly said that Queen Caroline was refused admission to Westminster Abbey, but the cabinet decided that she could not be excluded from an open ceremony. A place was reserved for her among the peeresses, and it was she who refused to enter the Abbey and sit with them. The Duke's part in bringing about the convulsion, as Canning called it, which shook the kingdom, was slight, and always on the moderating side, and he reminded the king that every evil which had occurred in the course of the inquiry was foreseen and foretold by ministers, who, however, which he does not say, could not muster courage to oppose the royal will. In fact, the only minister who resigned was Canning. The king was furious, but the offence was not mortal, for within 2 years, chiefly through the influence of Wellington, Canning, on the death of Lord Londonderry, became Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Before that event occurred, the Duke accompanied his sovereign to Belgium in 1821, and was his guide over the field of Waterloo. The king listened to his explanations, but showed no special interest, or took it coolly, as the Duke said, until he came to the grave of Lord Anglesea's leg, and then he burst into tears. He could sympathize at least with the loss of a handsome limb. There was a general peace in Europe, but the continent was not peaceful. The empires and kingdoms were no longer at war with each other, but more or less the people were at war with the emperors and kings. Greece was in open revolt, the Janissaries overawed the Sultan, the Neapolitans obtained a temporary mastery over their monarch, and the Spaniards held their king in practical duress. Then the Holy Alliance came into play in a notably worldly fashion. It was supposed at the time, and may be still, that the British government was subservient to a sanctimonious confederacy invented by the Emperor Alexander. But even his brothers of Austria and Prussia, who signed the treaty because they did not wish to offend him, thought he was affected in his mind. So far as the British ministers were concerned, they had nothing to do with what Castlereagh described as a piece of sublime mysticism and nonsense, which Alexander himself laid before him. The Duke of Wellington, he wrote, happened to be with me when the Emperor called, and it was not without difficulty that we went through the interview with becoming gravity. The Holy Alliance, although England had no share in it, was a real force enough. When the Neapolitans broke into insurrection, the British government stood out for non-interference, which was always Wellington's doctrine, and declined to be party to Austrian intervention. The internal conflicts in Spain placed them in still greater hostility to the plans of the Holy Allies. To determine what should be done, a congress was held at Verona, and Wellington was sent thither to represent his country. How he bore himself may be read in his dispatches, but he only carried out strictly the policy of his colleagues and his own. Lord Liverpool, writing to Canning before the Congress met, said that even if a change of dynasty were brought about in Spain, it would be no ground for hostile interference by the powers, and that the conduct and character of King Ferdinand made even the personal question the weakest he ever recollected in a case of revolution. Wellington at Verona informed the Emperor of Russia that, with us, it had become a principle not to interfere in the internal affairs of any country excepting in a case of necessity, and that this principle did not grow out of our parliamentary constitution, but ought to be the guide of all governments, be their constitutions what they might. Nothing can be plainer or more consistent with the entire course of Wellington's career. He told the Emperor at a later period that in his anxiety to fight the revolutionists he had left one ally out of his calculation. "Which is it?" Alexander asked. I replied, "Time." Time would remedy many of the evils complained of as resulting from the Spanish and other revolutions. But if that remedy were awaited, said Alexander, the bon gens and royalists would be lost. And so they parted. The truth is that the ultra-royalists, led by the Comte d'Artois and M. de Chateaubriand, were bent on invading Spain in order to fly the French flag and gather glory for the Restoration. Respecting the heir to the throne, Wellington in 1818 uttered some prophetic words. "The descendants of Louis XV," he wrote, "will not reign in France, and I must say, and always will say, that it is the fault of Monsieur and his adherents." It was they who forced on the Spanish War of Invasion, and it was they who ceased to reign in 1830. The Congress of Verona was the grand climacteric of the Holy Alliance, and it expired almost before the death of its projector and patron, the Emperor Alexander. One picturesque little fact outside the gloomy arena of politics which occurred in the ancient city has been preserved. Among strange scenes, few were stranger than that of Wellington and the Empress Maria Louisa, mother of the sometime King of Rome, playing at écarté and paying each other in napoleons. She was grateful to the Duke for winning Waterloo because in 1815 she had a lover who afterwards became her husband, and she was not in a condition to return with safety to her imperial spouse. Returning to England in the beginning of 1823, the Duke was obliged to defend, and did defend with point and vigour, the course pursued by himself as the agent of the government at Verona. There was a strong desire in some quarters to take part with the Spaniards, a desire which even those who felt it would have repressed had they been in office. We have seen what the policy was, how it was adverse to the domineering views of the Holy Alliance, and failed only because England by reason alone could not prevail, and disclaimed the idea of using force on either side. It is instructive to observe that all parties were under the delusion that the French invasion of Spain would strengthen the Bourbon monarchy, a delusion entertained by the French themselves, whereas it was one of the causes which led to the ultimate expulsion of Charles X. Wellington's course in the matter was honest and above board, and the sharp criticism showered upon him must be set down mainly to party exigencies as well as parliamentary custom. Canning, more impatient and defiant than the Duke, who never indulged in threats, longed to speak out his mind to the French, but it was not until 4 years afterwards that he uttered the famous sentence, "I called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the Old," being determined that if France had Spain, she should not have Spain and the Indies. The difference between the Duke and his colleague regarding the recognition of the Spanish colonies was one of degree, not principle. Canning wished to do the thing at once. The Duke, as usual, favoured moderation, yet even he, slow to move in such a matter, saw that recognition must come, only he would have gone no further than was necessary, but have had each case determined on its merits. At Verona, where the subject was discussed, he carefully left it in such a state that his government might do what it pleased. If Canning did not exactly call the New World into existence, since it had been more or less much alive since the beginning of the Peninsular War, he did call up something else. The Monroe Doctrine can claim him as its parent, for he suggested the declaration to Mr. Rush. At Verona, Wellington succeeded in averting a war between Russia and Turkey, which threatened the general peace, and Alexander went home a sadder if not a wiser man. Toward the end of 1825 he died rather suddenly at Taganrog, and his brother Nicholas, by virtue of a family compact, reigned in his stead. Wellington was dispatched to St. Petersburg on the accession of the new emperor, which gave him an opportunity of ascertaining, if possible, the intentions of the Czar toward Greece and Turkey. He was soon involved in a diplomatic tussle, not only with Nesselrode, but with the emperor also, and in the end he could do no more than defer for a time the meditated attack on the Sultan, and obtain a protocol having for its object a peaceful settlement of the acute Greek difficulty on a basis suggested by the Russians themselves. The time was now at hand when he would be summoned to take a more prominent position in the state, so far as office went. George IV. made the Duke Constable of the Tower in 1826, and when the death of the Duke of York early in the next year left vacant the post of Commander-in-Chief, it was at once bestowed on the Field Marshal, who announced his appointment to the army with characteristic simplicity and brevity. He was now in his right place, but fate decided that he should not remain in it long. Lord Liverpool, Prime Minister since 1812, fell hopelessly ill, and in April the King, sending for Canning, empowered him in the usual way to reconstruct the ministry on the principles which guided that of Lord Liverpool. "I need not add," Canning said in writing to the Duke, "how essentially the accomplishment of his task must depend upon your Grace's continuance as a member of the Cabinet." In reply to the obliging proposition, the Duke desired to know who was to be the Prime Minister, and the answer was in brief, Mr. Canning, who added that he had laid the letters before the King. Thereupon, observing that he thought Mr. Canning, with the best intentions, would not be able to hold fast the Liverpool principles, the Duke declined to join him, and followed up his refusal by resigning the offices of Commander-in-Chief and Master General of the Ordnance. The Duke was vehemently censured for his conduct, but it should be observed that he had no confidence in Canning, who himself had no right, political or moral, to the co-operation of Wellington. During the ministry of the brilliant orator, the King affected for 3 months to command the army. The Duke of Clarence became Lord High Admiral, and Russian influences so far prevailed in the Cabinet that the Protocol of St. Petersburg was converted into a vague treaty, which led to the Battle of Navarino, and forwarded Russian aggression quite as much as Greek emancipation. Lord Goderich, afterwards Earl of Ripon, succeeded Canning, but he could not hold his colleagues together, and in January 1828 the king sent for the Duke and made him his prime minister. He did not seek the office. In 1827 he said that he should be worse than mad to think of such a thing, but when requested by the king he took the post as he had taken others, holding himself to be, as he always put it, the retained servant of the crown. It is in this light that we must regard his assumption of a great responsibility, an office for which he said he was not qualified, yet was really far more qualified than many other men. The Canningites joined the government, and although the Emperor Nicholas, seeing his opportunity, made war on Turkey, the Duke loyally carried out the treaty negotiated by Canning, with the policy of which personally he so strongly disagreed. But he never would consent to be the mere leader of a party. He was always the servant of the state, and kept its compacts. That conviction of his duty was finally illustrated when he had to deal with the Roman Catholic question. Ireland, as he believed, especially after the election of O'Connell for Clare, was on the verge of civil war, and what civil war is he well knew. Moreover, it was his fixed opinion that whenever the consent of the crown could be obtained, the question could be settled. Personally, no religious prejudice withheld him from enfranchising the Roman Catholics. His opposition rested on broad and deep political grounds. But when the tide of opinion in both islands rose to a dangerous height, looking only to the common weal and setting aside his personal bias, he boldly told the truth to the king and secured his needed consent. He remarked long afterwards that justice would not be done to his action in settling the vexatious dispute until his communications to the king were published, and those documents, now accessible to all, are his justification. They and all his writings on his native country show that he did not at any time blink the facts which underlay its unhappy condition. If he were stern in requiring obedience to law, he did not spare the gentlemen of Ireland, whose treatment of their landed estates and neglect of their duties were so repugnant to his conscience and opposed to his practice. Dreading a civil war as one who knew what it was, he strove to avert the calamity, and fortunately did not strive in vain. How thoroughly he had gauged the dangers lurking in the whole question may be judged from the fact that in one of his earliest letters to the king he foresaw the possibility, I might state it more strongly, he says, of the Roman Catholic tenantry refusing to pay tithes or rents. The clergy and the landlords might have recourse to the law, but how is the law to be enforced? How can they distrain for rent or tithes on millions of tenants? He said it would probably be the first measure of resistance and rebellion. The words testified to his prescience, but the measures foreseen were not attempted until he had been many years in his grave. One might think that the men who set them in motion, not for their own sake, but as means to obtain an independent Parliament, had studied and caught up their schemes from the Duke's writings. He has been taunted with inconsistency because he brought his great influence to bear on all who were opposed to Roman Catholic emancipation. But no act of his life was in stricter accord with the fundamental principles governing his conduct. Early in the struggle with the king he said, "It is the duty of all to look our difficulties in the face and to lay the ground for getting the better of them." He had no fixed hostility to the concession. That it had been so long delayed was not his fault, and when he saw that it would deliver the country from a civil war, he thought it high time that the concession should be made. He was right in doubting whether it would pacify Ireland, which he had long seen aimed at independence, but whether it would or not, the contest with rebellion would be less arduous. Politics has been called the science of exigencies, and in this exigency the Duke, keeping the permanent interests of the United Kingdom in view, did what he believed was best for them. It was an act of expediency, and he certainly would never have set it upon what some would call a higher level. In like manner he acquiesced to the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, a futile remnant of exclusiveness which the legislature had to nullify every year by an Indemnity Act. The passing of these measures was accomplished because the Prime Minister of the day was not a party man. 3 considerable episodes, 2 serious and 1 comic, enlivened the stormy period of the Duke's administration. The comic episode grew out of the pretensions of the Duke of Clarence, Lord High Admiral. He took on himself to hoist his flag in the Thames, summon his board to Portsmouth, set forth in command of a squadron, all in excess of his powers under the law. The Duke courteously but firmly remonstrated. Even the King declared his brother hopelessly in the wrong, and in the end the Lord High Admiral, unable to prevail, resigned. But he bore no malice, for after defying his board or council he ended up shaking hands and asking them all to dinner at Bushey. Another disturbing influence of a grimmer kind was the Duke of Cumberland, and the constant troubles wrung from Wellington a cry of impatience. Between the King and his brothers, he wrote to Peel, the government of this country has become a most heart-breaking concern. Another trial was more grave. Mr. Huskisson thought fit to vote against his government, and immediately to give the Duke an opportunity of placing his office in other hands. The Duke took him at his word, but Mr. Huskisson did not mean to resign. He meant to draw forth a request that he should stay. The Duke, convinced that it was not with one individual but a party that he had to deal, would not entreat, and so Mr. Huskisson went out of office, and all the Canningites with him. Principles were paraded, but they were not at stake. The Duke said that he could not get a definition or clear idea of Whig, Tory, Liberal, or Mr. Canning's principles, adding in a pregnant passage, "This I know, that this country was never governed in practice according to the extreme principles of any party whatever, much less according to the extremes which other opposing parties attribute to their adversaries." The Canningites were replaced, and took their share out of the government in passing the measure so long supported alike by Castlereagh and Canning, Roman Catholic emancipation. End of Section 15. Section 16 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. Diplomatist and Statesman, Part 2. The third episode sprang armed out of the heat of the desperate conflict. The old Tories never forgave the Duke for his desertion, as they called it, and Lord Winchelsea wrote and published a letter in which he accused the Duke of having long used a show of zeal for the Protestant religion as a cloak under which he might carry out his insidious designs for the introduction of Popery. The insult was poignant, and as, after repeated attempts to obtain it, full reparation was refused, the Duke demanded satisfaction. Probably Lord Winchelsea never expected that he would be called to account so sharply, and was astonished when he found that his victim turned upon him. But he would not yield except on the ground, although he went to Battersea Fields with a determination not to fire at the Duke, and when he had stood fire to express his regret. So the duel passed. Wellington fired wide, Winchelsea in the air, and an apology was given in writing on the ground and publicly. The Duke was a dangerous man to trifle with, but it is notable that he had never been out before, and did not possess any duelling pistols. The Duke, however, always held that he was bound to act as he did. Lord Winchelsea, he said to Mr. Gleig in after years, did his best to establish the principle that a man in my situation must be a traitor unless he adheres through thick and thin to a policy once advocated. His attack on me was part of a plan to render the conduct of public affairs impossible to the King's servants, and thus the admission that he was wrong had to be extorted from him, nor should it be forgotten that the Duke took up the libel as a public matter. Writing a few weeks afterwards, he said that the duel was as much a part of the Catholic question as anything else he was obliged to do. He was living in an atmosphere of calumny. After the hostile meeting the air was cleared, and if the event itself shocked many good men, still it was necessary in the public interests, and none can say it was not effective in staying the evil. Throughout the whole contest with the king, the Duke of Cumberland, the Levants, and the old Tories, he was determined to carry the business and also to fight the battle in his own way. How much he felt at times is shown by his passionate outbursts in private, when the strain became too severe or the scenes at Windsor too distressing even for his patience. "If I had known in January 1828," he wrote in November 1829, "one tithe of what I do now, and of what I discovered 1 month after I was in office, I should never have been the king's minister, and should have avoided loads of misery. I believe there never was a man who suffered so much, and for so little purpose." An extravagant picture, perhaps, yet who can say what a man so straightforward and honest must have endured during nearly 3 years of office from the kind of people with whom he had to deal, not only, if mainly in conducting home affairs in a troubled time, but in working out a foreign policy left him as a legacy, and in thwarting, as far as he could, the designs of the Russian Emperor and his unscrupulous agents of both sexes. The hope he expressed in November 1829 that he might soon be relieved from the unhappy lot which had befallen him was gratified a year later, when, after the accession of William IV, the Revolution of July was the signal for an imperative demand for the reform of Parliament. The Whigs saw their chance. The old Tories, bent only on a policy of revenge, gratified their rancour regardless of anything else. In November 1830 the Wellington administration, defeated on a side issue, ceased to be, and the Duke got rid of his heavy burden. Although outvoted on the question of referring the civil list to a committee, it was parliamentary reform and Tory rancour which killed the Duke's government. Not that he was hostile to gradual change, such as the transfer of seats from corrupt boroughs to great towns. Had his advice prevailed, Birmingham would have sent members to Parliament long before 1832. He had as keen a contempt for the boroughmongers as Cobbett himself, and spoke with indignation of their conduct in selling seats to the highest bidder, which, vile in itself, was also the abuse of a great trust. The close boroughs, he considered, should have been used to bring able men of all shades of political opinion into Parliament, so as to produce a genuine representation, not of numbers, but of character and intellect. But the boroughmongers were as faithless to their obligations as the absentee landlords in Ireland, and all landlords who, looking only to their convenience or gains, neglected the duties incumbent on them as owners of landed property. This was the more grievous to him because he held the doctrine that the Constitution had a territorial basis, and that one of its foundation stones was the influence of real property. When people talked to him of the rights of the aristocracy, he said he knew nothing of them. The peers have rights and privileges under the Constitution, but out of doors the peers are no more than others of Her Majesty's subjects, except that they are exempt from arrest, have titles of honour and rank and precedence in society. In short, what he dreaded was a democratic Parliament, which would be in its nature hostile to the great institutions of the country and the essential interests of the society called the British Empire. What he failed to see was that a change was coming, if it had not come over the nation, which made the representative machinery of 1830 incompatible with peaceful national life, that the pivot of power had at last begun to shift from land to trade, commerce, and industry, and that the claim of these to share in power could not be denied. Nor is he to be blamed for that, still less for standing up steadfastly in defence of his convictions. "I feel no strength," he said, "excepting in my character for plain manly dealing," and he could not pretend to say he approved of measures which he passed, or those he abstained from opposing, when he did not love them. He fought the sweeping Whig Reform Bill as long as he could. He tried to form a government against it. He strove to modify when he could not reject it. But he announced his intention of absenting himself from the House of Peers, so soon as he saw that the national safety could only be preserved by the passing of the bill. Then he frankly accepted it as the law of the land, and hoped that the inevitable changes would be brought about so slowly as to mitigate their effects. He has been soundly rated for half a century because he made an imprudent declaration against a special measure of reform. It is a testimony to his worth, and his candor should have been appreciated. But simplicity, frankness, and plain manly dealing do not serve the interests of political parties or leaders of parties. The Duke, as it seems to us, was not by his character fitted for the work which they perform. He was never a mere party man or party leader. He was always the devoted servant of the Crown and the State, and the really astonishing thing is that he remained in office for nearly 3 years. Nothing but his high character kept him there, and it was his high character which finally expelled him. He belonged to the pre-democratic era, just going below the horizon in 1832. He did not quail before the multitude, nor mistake the quality of their cheers or groans. When Apsley House was threatened, he was prepared to defend it by force. When the windows were broken, he put up iron shutters and never took them down, nor did he ever fail to point to them on occasions when crowds saluted him with hurrahs. He was beset by a furious mob on the anniversary of Waterloo in 1832, when riding home from the Mint, and owed his life, perhaps, to the accident that he had an appointment in Lincoln's Inn, where the lawyers gallantly provided for his safety. The incident is ever memorable as a shining example of popular fickleness and folly. One can imagine the scene as he rode at a walking pace out of the inn, through the howling mob, pale but with a severe countenance, immovable on his saddle and looking straight before him, Sir Edward Sugden and another barrister forming the advance guard in this striking procession. Yet at this very moment the Reform Bill had become the Reform Act, and its final passage through the House of Lords was really effected by the prudence and wisdom of the man so bitterly assailed and outraged. But all mobs behave alike when under the influence of ignorance and passion, whether clad in broadcloth or fustian, and none knew that better than the Duke, who never allowed either to drive him from the course marked out for him by his sense of duty. That he could and did put aside his personal convictions for the common good is true, but to physical threats and the imminence of personal danger he never yielded one jot. The story of the Reform Bill is now ancient history, yet no generous mind can study it without recognizing the honorable and manly conduct of a statesman whose first and last thought was for his country and never for himself. That is why, with a standpoint so different, party men who wanted to and did admire him could never quite understand or calculate his course. The political crisis in the winter of 1834 through 1835, which was preceded by that somewhat astonishing incident, the selection of the Duke as Chancellor of the University of Oxford, affords another illustration. The first government of Lord Melbourne, from the action of causes to which we cannot even allude, suddenly disappeared one November morning. The Duke was at Strathfieldsaye, and was just going out hunting, when a king's messenger arrived from Brighton at 6 a.m, bearing a summons from King William. Thither the Duke hastened at once, and when the king told him that he had no ministry, he at once recommended his Majesty to send for Sir Robert Peel, and as Sir Robert was in Italy, the Duke offered to carry on the government until the wandering statesman reached England. The king assented, and the Duke was immediately appointed First Lord of the Treasury, and sworn in as Secretary of State for the Home Department, which enabled him to act in all the other offices. Nothing could be more astounding to the ordinary party mind except the promptitude with which a man who always went straight for the thing to be done entered on his collective functions. The same day, November 17th, he went direct to the Home Office, did business, looked in at the other offices, and assumed his place, making no changes, but doing the work to be done. Sir Robert was summoned home by express, and despite the wishes of the king, no appointment was made until he arrived. Thus, to the astonishment, amusement, and admiration of the public, the Duke for 3 weeks conducted what he laughingly called his dictatorship in complete accordance with the Constitution. He fixed his headquarters at the Home Office, and then sallied forth to perform his functions in the others. Sir Erskine May regards the expedient as one of a doubtful and anomalous character, adding that, as the Duke had exercised the extraordinary powers entrusted to him with honour and good faith, he was not subjected to parliamentary censure, even at a time when the temper of the House of Commons was so inflamed. In short, the Duke spoke truly when he said that he had not disposed of a single office nor done any act not essentially necessary for the service of the king and the country. It was a novel experience for the parties who divided the state, and certainly raised the Duke in general estimation. If they did not understand the motive which actuated him as a public servant, they appreciated the courage of the man who took all the responsibility and none of the patronage, who suddenly found the king without a government, and at once supplied one in his own person. Peel returned to London in December, and, forming a ministry in the usual way, gave the Foreign Office to the Duke. Parliament was dissolved, but the appeal to the country did no more than reinforce the Conservatives, who, beaten on successive divisions, resigned in April. The Duke's share in the labours of this brief administration is remarkable for two things. It was necessary to appoint a new ambassador to St. Petersburg, and the Duke selected Lord Londonderry. He never even started for his post, so huge an uproar was raised in and out of Parliament by the opposition that he retired. It was a pure bit of party fighting, and had nothing to do with the sole thing that animated the minister in selecting him, his fitness. Mr. Greville, reporting the Duke's conversation at the time, has this significant entry. He said he was not particularly partial to the man, nor ever had been, but that he was very fit for the post and was an excellent ambassador, procured more information and obtained more insight into the affairs of a foreign court than anybody, and that he was the best relater of what passed at a conference, and wrote the best account of a conversation of any man he knew. So that the fit man was sacrificed to party animosity and nothing else. It will be seen that in making this selection, imprudent from a party point of view, because it gave the opposition a pretext, the error of the Duke consisted of looking about for the man best fitted to do the work of an ambassador, which one might have supposed was precisely the duty of a foreign secretary. But the Duke never could be got to regulate his conduct on the curious and artificial rules of the politician, who was bound to think first of himself and his party. The other incident of his ministry redounded to his honour in a different way. The horrible cruelties practised by each side in the Carlist wars moved him to dispatch Lord Eliot to Spain, with instructions to bring both within the area of civilization. He was successful in his efforts. The slaughter of prisoners was stayed, and their treatment regulated by the Eliot Convention. It did not long endure, but it was an attempt to make civil war humane, and deserved a longer sway. Although the Duke of Wellington was included in the cabinet formed by Peel in 1841 and 1846, he never again held any political office. His function was to lead in the House of Lords, and holding that position, he so acted as to moderate opposition and help the ministers whenever he could. He has himself, in a letter to Lord Stanley, 1846, when pressing him to assume the leadership, described the principles on which he conducted his management of the Upper House for 20 years. He objected to all extreme and violent measures of opposition, supported the government on important occasions, used his influence to prevent the mischief of anything like a difference or division between the two houses. He endeavoured to guide, and did guide, opinion in the peers, and induced them to do what he thought best for the Crown, the Constitution, and the country. His last political service was in joining Sir Robert Peel to abolish the Corn Laws, much against his personal wish, and when that dangerous question came to a head, he wrote a letter to the Queen severing his connection with the Conservative party, which made him anxious that Lord Stanley should take his place and do as he had done. It is impossible, he writes, for me to do otherwise than is indicated in my letter to the Queen. I am the servant of the Crown and people. I have been paid and rewarded, and consider myself retained, and that I can't do otherwise than serve as required, when I can do so without dishonour, that is to say, as long as I have health and strength to enable me to serve." The principle which determined his course in 1845 and 46 was one now familiar to us from him. The question to be considered when Sir Robert Peel undertook to do what Lord John Russell would not attempt, he said, was not what the Corn Laws should be, but whether the Queen should have a government, or, as he told Croker, the position he had taken up was not on the Corn Law. His object was to maintain a government in the country. That position, after long years, came to be well understood by the public, and the knowledge of it finally extinguished every idea that the Duke was a high Tory or even a party man, a dictator or a mere soldier. He was, in his political as well as in his military character, pre-eminently a great national servant, always intent on promoting what, according to his cool judgment, was best for the common weal. End of section 16. Section 17 of Wellington by George Hooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11. Old Age. If the Duke of Wellington were 20 or 30 years younger, he ought to be on horseback and on the field with Runjeet Singh, instead of being called in to arrange the affairs of maids of honour and the palace, was his remark to Lord Stanhope in March 1839. 2 years later, George Broadfoot, shut up in Jalalabad, wrote, "Set the Duke down at Ferozepur with carte blanche, both contempt of the enemy and timidity would disappear, and Afghanistan would soon be our own to keep or abandon." The dream of the valiant young soldier, of course, could not be realized. His hero was, and felt himself to be, too old. His deafness, the result of improper treatment, became yearly worse, and he had suffered from those severe attacks of illness which made O'Connell chuckle over the thought that one of whom he was always afraid would soon die. The death of Lord Hill in 1842 made Wellington commander-in-chief by patent and for life. All remember how, when the news of Chilianwalla filled men with dismay, asked to submit 3 names to the government as fit successors to Sir Hugh Gough, he wrote down thrice Sir Charles Napier. Still more does it dwell in the memory that he fixed the resolution of Sir Charles by saying, "If you will not go, I must." That was an appeal which could not be withstood. Later still, the old fire blazed up when he undertook to thwart the Chartists on April 10, 1848, and kept his word so well and made such solid arrangements that tranquillity was preserved without showing a soldier or firing a shot. "Well, Duke, it has all turned out as you foretold," said Sir John Campbell. "Oh, yes," was the reply. "I was sure of it, and I never showed a soldier or musket, but I was ready. I could have stopped them wherever you liked, and if they had been armed it would have been all the same." That was his last military triumph, and he was pardonably elated at its bloodless success. Few living can remember him as he was in the prime of his manhood, but many cherish the recollection of the silver-haired veteran, wearing a blue coat and white waistcoat and trousers, riding or walking through the streets, or painfully listening with one hand to his best ear in the House of Lords. Age slowly sapped his strength. Music, which he so loved, was lost to him, and he had to give up his hunting. But he rose early, worked as of old, and neglected no duty. If he became irritable and had his quick temper less under control, that was due to failing powers, and he was painfully conscious of the weakness. It was only trifles that moved him. On grave subjects he was patient and ready to bear with opposition all his life. But no man is so privileged as to escape human infirmity. The publication of his dispatches by Colonel Gurwood raised him immensely in public estimation, and he was seen as he was for the first time. One might say that despite the splendor of his active military career and the enthusiasm it aroused, men did not come to know him truly until he had grown old, and then admiration passed into a sort of reverence which shed a halo over his declining years. Baron Stockmar having said that he was one-sided, Prince Albert answered, "He is a fresh illustration of the truth that to achieve great results and do great deeds a certain one-sidedness is essential." Certainly it is better to be a Wellington than a Hamlet. The nation agreed with Queen Victoria when she said, "He was the pride and the genius, as it were, of the country." How true the phrase is was shown when his startling letter to Sir John Burgoyne was printed. From his watch-tower at Walmer he looked around and saw that the south of England was defenceless, and said so in plain terms. The nation was electrified, and from that day in 1848 may be dated the modern measures for the defence of our coast and the reinforcement of our army. The warning came with triple energy from one who had been always a votary of real economy and a fervid champion of peace. It was he who wrote in 1841, "May God preserve the general peace. Man will not if left to himself." Throughout his life he was generous and gave without stint. His conduct towards Alava offers a conspicuous example. Even Cobbett, who called him an old ruffian, found that the Duke was not a miser. He carried loose sovereigns in his pocket to bestow on any of his old soldiers in distress. When General Brenier, captured at Vimiero, was prisoner, Sir Arthur, as he then was, lent the Frenchman £500, which was never repaid. He was absolutely unostentatious in giving. Mr. Gleig once saw a private record of his charities, which in 1 year reached £4,000. He was the cheerful victim of impostors and even delinquents, saying when rebuked, "What could I do? One could not let the man starve." His kind-heartedness came out in many ways. Seeing a short gentleman on one occasion at court straining every joint to obtain a glimpse of the Queen, he placed him before himself, and the little man was so delighted that he asked for a living. At a review in the Champ de Mars he befriended a small boy by mounting him on the back of his own chair. Obliged to join the French princes, the Duke consigned the boy to the care of his father, and a few days afterwards the father applied for a loan. Such experiences never narrowed his sympathies. His kindness to children is well known. Georgina, Dowager Lady de Ross, has told us how he romped with the children and allowed his young guests at Walmer to fight the Battle of Waterloo with him, a conflict which began by one of them flinging a cushion at the newspaper he was reading, and how indignant he was when he saw that his little favourites had no jam with their bread and butter. But the prettiest story is told by Lord Stanhope. 2 tiny guests at Walmer, seeing that every one received letters by post, wished that they might have some. Thereupon the Duke wrote a little letter to each every morning, and had it delivered to them when the post arrived. It was a different feeling, indeed a sense of justice, which made him, as Constable of the Tower, give to non-commissioned officers the post of yeoman warder. Preceding constables, following an old usage, had sold them. One of his latest acts was a serious proposal that the Prince Consort should command the army through a chief of the staff, an obvious error which the Prince had the prudence to set aside. In the year when it was made, 1850, a little prince was born on May 1st, the Duke's birthday. The name of Arthur was bestowed on him, and King William of Prussia and the Duke were the sponsors. The next year, at the opening of the first exhibition, as the Queen records, the old Duke and Anglesey walked arm in arm in the procession, which was a touching sight. Another year passed, and then the Duke faded peacefully away at Walmer in September, and after lying in state at Chelsea Hospital was solemnly buried by the side of Nelson in St. Paul's Cathedral. All the nations in Europe except Austria were represented at his grave, and as the organ peals ceased and the mighty multitude separated, the whole world felt not only that an epoch had visibly ended, but that a great captain and a supremely dutiful, honest man, leaving behind him a stainless record, had gone from among them forever. The End. End of Section 17. Recording by Pamela Nagami in Encino, California, 2017. End of Wellington by George Hooper.